Iran-Contra channeled money to states already considered terrorist nations like Iran, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon. And there's the other half of the handshake. Trillions of dollars in illegal narcotics have made their way into this country from the Middle East, the Far East, and Latin America. It shows a pattern of fraud and complicity by the US government to promote instability abroad to further their domestic agenda. And it goes a long way to explain its governance of the ISI and Al-Qaeda. The war between the Soviets and the Afghans ended in 1979. Meanwhile, the drug trade from Latin America was heating up, with significant assistance from the CIA. It started big time with the formation of the Medellin drug cartel in Colombia in 1978. Founded by Carlos Leader, the Ochoa brothers, and Pablo Escobar, the Medellin cartel operated by manufacturing the coca plant into cocaine and shipping it to the US.
The collaboration began when Leader purchased an island in the Bahamas,
where corporate tax and banking laws are extremely lenient,
and used that land as a jumping off point to launder the money taken in by the drug sales.
The Bahamas is home to thousands of tax-exempt corporations,
including companies owned and managed by American International Group, AIG. One of AIG's companies in the Bahamas is named after a woman called Coral Talavera. She's Carlos Leader's wife. She is the head of an AIG branch in San Francisco. Carlos Leader was extradited from Colombia to the United States for trial in 1987. A year later, he was convicted and sentenced to life plus 135 years for drug trafficking and murder. While he was in prison, Carlos Leader struck a deal with the United States. Take down the cartel, and he would be granted freedom. Along the way, he implicated and then testified against Manuel Noriega, Panamanian dictator and middleman for the Medellin cartel.
Noriega was captured through an invasion of Panama in 1989 under the first President Bush.
He was convicted of drug running, racketeering, and money laundering in 1992. One thing connects them all: the BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or for our discussion today, the granddaddy of all money laundering scams. The BCCI was and remains the largest instance of fraud and bankruptcy in global history. Located out of Abu Dhabi, the BCCI operated without fail throughout the 70s and 80s as a money laundering and investment finance bank. Financial ties can be made between the BCCI and Manuel Noriega through his facilitation of the drug trade. By 1992, the BCCI was broke and busted up by US authorities.
Okay, the greatest drug smuggler in the history of drug smuggling was a guy named Barry Seal. Barry Seal, okay? He was an admitted CIA agent, okay? He was contracted at least as back as like the early 60s.
Now in the early 70s, Barry Seal was running cocaine through New Orleans. He's running it on planes later identified to be former Air America planes.
The planes used by the CIA in the 50s and 60s to ship heroin from the Far East.
When the Medellin cartel is founded, Seal immediately hooks up with their operation. By 1981, he is trafficking in more drugs than anyone in the history of this country. And it is around this time that Barry Seal moves his operation from New Orleans to Mena, Arkansas. A small little out-of-the-way mountain town. A small little out-of-the-way mountain town that just so happens to have a major U.S. airport. The Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport. From at least 1981 to 1986, this airport is ground zero for all illegal narcotics activity in the United States. You see, Barry Seal, he began flying his drugs into this airport, most likely with the knowledge of then President Reagan and the next two presidents, Bush and Clinton.
My name's Chip Tatum, and I'm an ex-intelligence officer for the United States government. I went through Special Forces training as a combat controller and was subsequently sent to Vietnam. I moved in and out of Vietnam under the operational control of the CIA attached to a company called Air America. In 1985, I was tasked with infiltrating a unit at Fort Stewart, Georgia. The unit was a medevac unit. The Nicaraguan Revolution was well underway, so as a medevac helicopter pilot, I would be able to support whatever the intelligence needs were posing as that medevac helicopter pilot. So on the back of our flight plans, I would normally try to cover ourselves and provide insurance for what was going on. My passengers were written on the back of the flight plan after I landed, and anything having to do with the mission that was of interest were written on the back of the flight plans after I landed. On the 16th of March, I was tasked to fly 2 individuals from Tegucigalpa on a sightseeing mission around Honduras, over the camps and back into Pomarola Air Base. We were flying an aircraft 228. Our passengers were a R. Young of the Arkansas National Guard. Young was the security chief for Governor Clinton of Arkansas. And an M. Harari, who represented interests of Panama and was referred to as Ambassador Harari. Harari, I would find out later, was actually Mike Harari, a Mossad agent assigned to General Manuel Noriega as a confidant. During the flight, I had installed a cassette tape recorder that recorded all conversations on board the aircraft. We did activate that recorder during the flight. Personnel in the back of the aircraft, talking on our private intercom, did not know that what they were saying was not private. In the conversation between Mr. Harari and Mr. Young was asking Mr. Harari basically, what's going on here? But he says Arkansas has the capability to manufacture anything in the area of weapons, and if we don't have it, we'll get it. Harari said in return, how about government controls? Well, Young then came in and said the governor's on top of it, and if the feds get nosy, we hear about it and make a call. Then they're called off. He was looking around the countryside and continued, why the hell would anyone fight for a shithole like this? Harari referred, shaking his head in awe. What we do has nothing to do with preserving a country's integrity. It's just business. And third world countries see their destiny as defeating borders and expanding. The more of this mentality we can produce, the greater our wealth. Train and we arm. That's our job. And in return, we get a product, far more value than money for a gun. We're paid with the product, and we credit top dollar for the product. Buddy was still looking confused, and Mike continued. Look, one gun and 3,000 rounds of ammo is $1,200. A kilo of product is about $1,000. We credit the Contras $1,500 for every kilo. That's top dollar for a kilo of cocaine down here. It's equivalent to the Americans' Kmart special, buy 4, get 1 free. On our side, we spend $1,200 for a kilo and sell it for $12,000 to $15,000. Now that's a profit center, and the market is much greater for the product than for the weapons. It's just good business sense, understand? Buddy responded with, damn, so you guys promote wars and revolution to provide weapons for drugs. We provide the non-numbered parts to change out, and we all win. Damn, that's good. Harari, the Mossad agent, said in return, it's good when it works, but someone, how do you say, has his hand in the gopher? Buddy responding on the defenses. Well, we get our 10% right off the top, and that's plenty. Goofus can make it go a long way. Harari responded to that. Who is Goofus? Governor Clinton. That's our pet word for him. You know, they call the president POTUS for President of the United States. Well, we call Clinton Goofus for Governor of the United States. He thinks he is, anyhow. That's your problem in America, Harari responded. You have no respect for your elected officials. They're more powerful than you think and have ears everywhere. You should heed my words and be loyal to your leaders, especially when speaking to persons like me. Your remarks indicate a weakness, something our intelligence analysts look for. Ah, hell, Mike, everybody knows that Clinton wants that White House and will do anything to get it. That's why I'm here instead of someone else. We know about the cocaine. Hell, I've picked it up before with Lassiter when he was worried about going on to Little Rock Air Base to get it. And in finishing their conversation, he spoke of a man named Barry Seal. Buddy Young said, Seal and his guys, I like his attitude, and leave the driving to us, he said, quoting one of Seal's good old boys, saying, you like Seal? Mike asked. Buddy returned with, hell, he's the only one I trust. Respect is the word. Do you see much of him? Harari asked. Hell yeah, we test drive Clinton's rides before we send him on, you know? He laughed, grinding his hips, saying, how much coke do you reckon you can make in a week? Harari responded with, one camp can produce 400 keys a week. The others are about half that, but that's just our operation here. We have other sources in various parts of the world. Why do you ask? What? Oh, the governor wanted to know our capacity.
The MENA operation, it's already in jeopardy, but it becomes a major problem when one of SEAL's former planes is shot down by Sandinistas later on in 1986. The only survivor of the crash is a man named Eugene Hassenfuss, and he claims he is running cocaine for the CIA. The plane can be tracked back to MENA. So for the time being, the MENA operation is close to being exposed. It is suspected that SEAL traffics in nearly $5 billion worth of cocaine in this 5-year period. So SEAL is virtually untouchable for this period. Even though the FBI and the DEA have all opened up investigations into his operation, he remains a contract agent with the CIA. But with overwhelming evidence of drug trafficking mounting against him, he finally turned states in 1985. He testifies in several trials against Medellin traffickers. And this compromises the entire CIA operation. I mean, Barry Seal isn't only running drugs for the cartel, he's also involved in the drugs for arms trade in Nicaragua. The DEA even places him in a sting to photograph Contras loading cocaine onto an airplane in Nicaragua.
And this pisses the CIA off, but good!
Seal's next mission is to trick Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers into coming to a neutral third-party country where they will be extradited. I mean, he's about to take down the entire Medellin cartel. But then news of Seal's cooperation with the DEA became leaked in the national media. He has to be called back in midair from his task to meet with the Ochoa brothers and Pablo Escobar. And who is responsible for this press leak? Admittedly, it is none other than Oliver North, the primary figurehead in the Iran-Contra scandal. Barry Seals laid a gun down in Baton Rouge, assassinated by the Medellin cartel. It is rumored that on his dead body is the personal private phone number of George H.W. Bush.
Well, at least I wouldn't be from George Bush and the CIA dealing in drugs, right, Bo?
Unbelievable.
Right? Yeah, George Bush and the CIA dealing in drugs.
While we look at where George H.W. Bush was and what he was doing in 1984. According to Wikipedia, in 1984, U.S. officials began receiving reports that the CIA's Nicaraguan Contras, supervised by George Bush Sr., were involved in cocaine trafficking. 3 officials told journalists that they considered these reports reliable. George Bush was not in the middle of drug trafficking by Nicaraguan Contras. He was at the very top, in charge of the whole thing.
Soler Castillo worked on the front lines in the U.S. war against drugs.
I remember down in Central America, we were refueling planes full of cocaine coming into the U.S., and it was a CIA operation being run by the White House. George Bush Sr. came to Guatemala on January 13, 1986, and he approached me and asked me what I did there at the U.S. Embassy, what my job description was, and I told him I was a DEA agent working international narcotics investigations, and I told him, look, you know, we have gathered intelligence that the Contras are involved in drug trafficking down in El Salvador. And then he just smiled, shook my hand, and walked away from me. And it was then and there that I knew that my government knew that these atrocities were occurring.
Even Robert Bonner, the head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, agreed.
We understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America.
Well,
in cooperation with the CIA?
that's exactly what appears to have happened.
In 1984, Bush's cocaine trade is booming so loud that U.S. officials, foreign governments, and journalists are all starting to engage in very dangerous talk about it. Panama was then, as it is today, the center of Bush's cocaine money laundering operations. Today, Panama is still identified by the U.S. State Department and the Drug Enforcement Agency as a primary repository and conduit for Colombian and Mexican narco-trafficking cartels. Death squad leaders, of course, are not nice people. In El Salvador, they murdered American priests and raped and murdered American nuns. They've murdered dozens and dozens of journalists throughout Central America.
The question is, why are we supporting El Salvador?
No, the question was, why are we killing priests in El Salvador?
The answer is we're not. Now you be quiet. President Cristiani is trying to do a job for democracy, and the left-wing guerrillas must not take over El Salvador.
American Catholics helped push the Congress to cut off funding for the death squads. And Bush's response, with the help of the rest of the Dark Lords, was to flood the black and brown neighborhoods in America with crack cocaine in order to make money for themselves, of course, and to use some of the money to fund the death squads, and to create a substantial group of loyal and sympathetic billionaires who could be relied upon to fund the Bushes and other CIA candidates. And, just as a bonus, they would be able to use crack cocaine to imprison and otherwise destroy the lives of millions of black and brown Americans.
Smug, greedy, well-fed white people have invented a language to conceal their sins. It's as simple as that. The CIA doesn't kill anybody anymore. They neutralize people. Or they depopulate the area. The government doesn't lie. It engages in disinformation. The Pentagon actually measures nuclear radiation in something they call sunshine units. Israeli murderers are called commandos. Arab commandos are called terrorists. Contra killers are called freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight? They never mention that part of it to us, do they? Never mention that part of it.
Iran-Contra was a conspiracy, and yet it was kept as a total secret from the media, or perhaps by the media, for years. Not only was it possible to hide this from the public, but most of the government was unaware of the activities of a small cabal from within.
Our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands, that no concessions policy remains in force. In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we. A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
The Reagan administration had a major scandal on its hands.
What has been going on that had been kept from me in various covert operations?
President, did they deceive you? You didn't answer whether Poindexter and North deceived you.
We had weapons being sold by the Pentagon under the Economy Act to the CIA, and the CIA selling them to a third party or an agent, in the case of General Secord, who would then complete the transactions.
I'm just trying to find out where the authorities were coming from to do these activities. I mean, clearly there was no congressional oversight over this because it was kept totally hidden from the Congress. From whom would you have to get the green light in order to make the request or the direction, I take it, to Secord to move ahead?
Well, as I have testified, Senator, I talked to Director Casey, I talked to Mr. McFarland, I talked to Admiral Poindexter.
John Poindexter was convicted of conspiracy. Here we have a massive geopolitical covert operation done by a faction within the American government concentrated in the office of the Vice President and the Department of Defense, working jointly with a faction in Israel to illegally sell arms and drugs in order to procure profits to pay off the Contras to fight the Sandinistas. And the entire time that the Americans and the Israelis are working together to do this, the Israelis were spying on the United States and stealing nuclear secrets. It wasn't until after Iran-Contra was busted that Jonathan Pollard was also ousted as a spy for Israel and thrown in jail.
The 56 hostages taken captive at the U.S. Embassy in Iran in 1979 became a major issue in Jimmy Carter's campaign for re-election to a second term as president. His repeated efforts to gain their release failed, and Ronald Reagan was elected by a wide margin.
There were 2 meetings that we know of for certain to date that happened, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Paris, France, before the 1980 election in October of 1980. They met with an emissary of the Khomeini regime who offered a deal that they thought Reagan and Bush could not refuse, and that was, we will delay the release of the 52 hostages if you will promise us all the arms that we could possibly want in the war against Iraq once you become president of the United States.
The man who was president of Iran during the hostage crisis was Abul Hassan Bani Sadr. He was later ousted in a coup and is now living in exile in Paris. Bani Sadr supports the charges that a deal was made with the Reagan-Bush campaign to delay the hostages' release. In a recent interview, he confirms that the Paris meeting took place and states that George Bush was specifically identified as being at the meeting by Iranian intelligence reports. Also identified were Monikar Ghorbanifar and Albert Hakim, who later emerged as key middlemen in the Iran-Contra scandal. As evidence of this agreement, Bani Sadr has made documents available showing written orders for shipment of American parts and weapons to Iran through an Israeli-owned company.
Yet questions remain about Vice President Bush's role in the Iran arms sale. He insists he was out of the loop, uninformed about the events and the risks of the Iran initiative. But the record shows Mr. Bush attended more than 15 meetings in the Oval Office at which the arms sales were discussed. But he says he cannot recall hearing any strong objections. In his most recent account, Mr. Bush writes, "Had there been any strenuous objection, I am sure I would have remembered it." The record shows Bush was there when Secretary of State Schultz argued against the arms sales. Quote, "As forcefully as I could. I was intense." The Vice President now says He would have objected to the plan if only he had known the real terms.
But I wish with clairvoyant hindsight that I had known that we were trading arms for hostages as the report concluded, and then I would have weighed in very heavily with the president to that effect.
But the record shows he did know. Mr. Bush was told it was an arms for hostages swap by this man, Amiron Nir, the Israeli who coordinated the trade. At a briefing arranged by Oliver North, Nir told Bush directly the deal was an effort to get the hostages out, the whole package for a fixed price. They fear that if they give us all the hostages, they won't get anything from us.
Mr. Vice President, you set the rules for this talk here. I didn't mean to step on your line there, but you insisted that this be live, and you know that we have a limited amount of time.
That's why I want to get my share in here on something other than what you want to talk about.
The President has spoken for himself. I'm asking you to speak for yourself, which you have not been willing to do in the past.
Well,
and if I may suggest that this is what leads people to say, quote, either George Bush was irrelevant or he was ineffective. He said himself he was out of the loop. Now, let me give you an example. You said ask a question.
May I explain out of the loop? No operational role. Go ahead.
Now, you've said that if you'd known it was an arms for hostage swap, you would have opposed it. You said the first you knew it was an arms for hostage swap was in December of 1986,
when the
correct?
whole thing became briefed to me by Senator Durenberger.
Exactly.
And the proximity of arms to hostages much closer.
But, Mr. Vice President, you went to Israel in July of 1986, yes. And a member of your own staff, Mr. Craig Fuller, has verified, and so did the only other man there, Mr. Nir, Mr. Amiron Nir, who's the Israelis' top anti-terrorist man.
Yes.
Those two men were in a meeting with you, and Mr. Nir not once but three times underscored with you that this was a straight-out arms for hostage swap.
What they were doing.
Now,
Read
how
the
do you
Read the memo. What they were doing.
How can you reconcile that you were there, Mr. Nir, underscored three separate occasions that it was an arms for hostage swap and told you were dealing with the most radical elements in Iran?
The CIA, along with Zionist hawk Michael Ledeen and Iran-Contra middleman Ghorbanifar, financed their operations with illegal arms and drug sales. Opium from Laos during the Vietnam Wars in the Golden Triangle, cocaine from Central and South America, and presently opium in the Golden Crescent from Afghanistan.
The use of U.S. government money for supporting the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government was specifically prohibited when Congress enacted the Boland Amendment in 1984. Even though it remained in effect until 1986, millions of dollars in profits from Iranian arms sales were secretly diverted to the Contras during this period through contacts with middlemen such as Moniker Ghorbanifar.
Mr. Ghorbanifar took me into the bathroom, and Mr. Ghorbanifar suggested several incentives to make that February transaction work. And the attractive incentive for me was the one he made, that residuals could flow to support the Nicaraguan resistance.
Even Ghorbanifar knew that you were supporting the Contras.
Yes, he did. Izvestia knew it. The name had been in the papers in Moscow. It had been all over Danny Ortega's newscast. Radio Havana was broadcasting it. It was in every newspaper in the land.
All our enemies knew it, and you wanted to conceal it from the United States Congress.
We wanted to be able to deny a covert operation.
The black market weapons trade and the sale of illegal drugs such as cocaine and opium are routine methods to finance black ops. Off-the-book operations hidden from oversight. In fact, some of the same people, Ledeen and Ghorbanifar, have themselves neck-deep in the Niger forgeries. The Iran-Contra scandal has since been admitted to. However, many of the people involved did not get in any real trouble. They were simply given presidential pardons, either by Bush Sr. or Bill Clinton. And the commission chosen to investigate the affair was actually chosen to cover it up. This pattern of crime and damage control continues. Take Brent Scrowcroft, on the Tower Commission to investigate illegal arms sales, later chairman of the American Turkish Council, and involved in illegal arms trades himself. On the House Select Committee to investigate the illegal arms trades with Iran was the ranking Republican, Dick Cheney. Later made Secretary of Defense after the Senate refused to confirm John Tower of the Tower Commission whitewash. Dick Cheney, of course, would serve as vice president for George Bush's son, W. A lead investigator into Iran-Contra gave most of the key suspects immunity. His name was Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton was later chosen to be part of the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission was a complete farce and a total whitewash. Let's just say Lee Hamilton had experience covering for the national security state. He didn't lose any sleep over helping the neocons where Cold Warrior meets Zionist fanatic. The Contra operation was run out of the office of the Vice President by former CIA Director George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. was the director when the CIA was preparing intelligence cells in Pakistan and Afghanistan to fight a proxy war with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Call them modern privateers. Iran-Contra took the Kissinger model to new heights. Never had the military and intelligence agencies sought so many private sector sources of finance to such a degree. And in keeping with the distancing factor of the old British system of privateering, combined with the leverage of the global arms industry market, the U.S. had no shortage of willing partners to needlessly kill for profit. Every time the CIA or any other intelligence agency does a covert operation, that's a conspiracy. It's a bunch of people getting together in secret to do something illegal and lying to everyone else.
The official version of 9/11 is a terribly bad B-movie. It is a massive insult to our intelligence and all too significantly reveals the depth of mind control that many in our world are subject to. All too ironically, those of us who are not so brain dead as to believe the official version are called conspiracy theorists, despite the obvious fact that the official version of 9/11 is in fact, you guessed it, a conspiracy. It just so happens to be the most ridiculous conspiracy of them all. So let us imagine a crime so audacious that it was practically advertised before it was even committed. In addition to the incredible act of false flag terrorism that is the 9/11 operation, I am talking about the supreme crime of aggression, defined by the International Criminal Court as the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution of an act using armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state. Well, that is precisely what these criminals in positions of public trust did. First they planned, then they boldly laid out those plans in two documents. The first one, written in 1996, was entitled Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And it argued for regime change in Iraq based on the pretext that Saddam Hussein was a security threat developing weapons of mass destruction.
Written by Richard Pearl, which claimed that the road to Damascus ran through Baghdad. They also wrote in 2000, prior to 9/11, a report called the Afghan Vortex, which called for war in Afghanistan. This was all prior to 9/11.
The second document, written in 2000, called for much, much more than regime change. That document was entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. This document laid out a plan that would require multiple wars of aggression and occupation so as to achieve a goal of full spectrum dominance. The name of the group proposing these criminal policies was the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC.
A neoconservative think tank comprised of Zionists with prominent positions in the media and government. They published a large work of lies, but because of the Pentagon-press relationship, their deceptions got to be front and center on the news channels. And with the clout of 9/11 being used as an emotional club to beat down dissenting voices, they got their way. This was a war for and by Israeli interest. The rationales for the war would flip-flop several times, but each pre-invasion lie had its roots with the PNAC cabal.
PNAC is at first called a Republican think tank, but finds itself later termed a neocon or neoconservative group.
You've expressed some concern over the idea that this is all a conspiracy whipped up by a group of, quotes, neoconservative hawks who are somehow allied to Israel, and you've expressed worries about that. Explain what you're concerned about.
Look, sometimes the word neoconservative is used when what they really would like to say is Jew.
They being?
People who use that kind of language. And as a Jew, I find it offensive. And the other thing that I find deeply offensive about it is it contains a very old anti-Semitic canard, which is that the Jews, this scattered little people around the world, have these occult powers and are pulling the strings of the naive and duped
non-Jews.
Member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl, and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor. He often expresses extremist and often ridiculous anti-Arab and anti-Muslim views. More recently, he wrote an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal openly admitting his racist hatred of Islam, claiming that Islam should be the enemy, not terrorism.
To be fair, the Project for a New American Century did have one token Islamic figure, or, to use the terminology of the late great Malcolm X, a lone house Muslim. Basically, this involves the American empire establishing global control of air, land, sea, and space, and cyberspace. In order to achieve this goal, a primary objective was to seize the world's largest energy reserves, specifically the oil and gas reserves of the former Soviet republics in the Caspian Basin, as well as the oil of Iraq, the former requiring the control of a pipeline route to deliver said oil and gas to international markets. Another objective was to establish permanent military bases in this strategic area so as to ensure rapid deployment to any trouble spots where the natives might just get a little bit restless.
Back to the PNAC authors. Paul Wolfowitz made a statement before the U.S. House National Security Committee which called for a war with Iraq. He also wrote a letter in 1999 claiming that the bloodlust for Iraq wasn't partisan because a couple of Democrats, you may recognize them, Joseph Lieberman and John Kerry, also agreed with their position. Well, Wolfowitz was right about something. It was not partisan because both parties are one party on foreign affairs, and both parties wanted war. Here's another one from the Zionist think tank written by Robert Kagan, the co-founder of PNAC, titled Saddam's Impending Victory. It goes on to make comparisons to Hitler in the first few sentences. They love creating new Hitlers. It also talks about weapons of mass destruction and says that the lid is about to come off. Remember, this is in 1998. The lid is about to come off. The paper refers to Saddam's palaces as the so-called palaces, as if they were something else and hiding something, like the weapons of mass destruction it mentions probably a dozen times. Next, we have a paper written by William Crystal and Robert Kagan, the two co-founders of PNAC. It's titled Bombing Iraq Isn't Enough. January 30th, 1998. Want to take a wild guess at what the content says? Saddam Hussein must go. This imperative may seem too simple for some experts or too daunting for the Clinton administration, but if the United States is committed, as the President said in his State of the Union message, to ensuring that the Iraqi leader never again uses weapons of mass destruction, the only way to achieve that goal is to remove Mr. Hussein and his regime from power. Any policy short of that will fail. Mr. Hussein has obviously thought through this scenario, and he likes his chances. That is why he provoked the present crisis, fully aware that it could lead to American bombing strikes. He has survived them before, and he is confident that he can survive them again. They will not succeed in forcing him to abandon his efforts to obtain weapons of mass destruction. The only way to remove the threat of those weapons is to remove him. That means using air power and ground forces and finishing the task left undone in 1991. Lies about Iraq and 9/11 are all inside PNAC's papers. The authors are the same people involved in Israeli spy rings and Israeli arms sales.
Now, the PNAC plan complemented another goal known as the Greater Israel Project. Going back to statements from the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, the so-called Promised Land extends from the Nile River of Egypt to the Euphrates in Iraq. In Oded Yanan's A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s, Israeli regional superiority was to be achieved through a process of reconfiguring the Middle East by the balkanization of the surrounding Arab states into smaller and weaker states divided along sectarian lines. Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia were all in the crosshairs, but Israeli strategists viewed Iraq as their biggest challenge of all. And thus Iraq was outlined as the centerpiece to the balkanization of the Middle East. Iraq was to be divided into a Kurdish state, a Shiite Arab state, and a Sunni Arab state. The first step towards establishing this goal, however, was to instigate a war between Iraq and Iran, a war that would significantly weaken both states.
Here is a brief summary of the general understanding of what neocons believe. They agree with Trotsky on permanent revolution, violent as well as intellectual. They are for redrawing the map of the Middle East and are willing to use force to do it.
So while Saddam Hussein served wonderfully as an attack dog against Iran, The moment he had fulfilled his utility, he became the butcher of Baghdad, and the balkanization of Iraq merely required a pretext. And that brings us back to the PNAC lunatics and their full-spectrum dominance agenda that required multiple wars and the inevitable bloodbaths that would follow. The only problem from their perspective was that the American public could not possibly be told the truth of this plan because there was simply no way that they would support it. So how would PNAC achieve this goal? Well, they acknowledged in writing that only one thing could deliver them the means to achieve their psychopathic dream, and that was, quote, a new Pearl Harbor. Only such an event could whip the American public up into the fever pitch of vengeance that could serve as the pretext for multiple wars. And lo and behold, the gift of 9/11 was provided, and the farcical War on Terror was born. Muslims became the new boogeyman. The clash of civilizations as envisioned by Zionist ideologue Bernard Lewis was instigated, and the Middle East would soon be set alight.
From the pre-war hype to the cover-up, they were involved every step of the way. Anyone refusing to acknowledge that the Iraq War was planned and sold to us by this cabal of dual-citizen Israelis must be a fool. They wrote verbatim the pre-war hype 5 years before the war. These same people later faked evidence for their deceptions and used moles in the media to repeat the garbage that they had already been writing in the PNAC papers. But until born-again Zionist Bush, no one was stupid enough to listen to it.
Stephen Friedman, a senior principal at Marsh Capital and former partner at Goldman Sachs, who later became George W. Bush's top economic advisor. Friedman was also a member of the Brookings Institution, the Bilderberg Group, the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and the board at In-Q-Tel. In another interesting coincidence, Friedman belonged through Cornell University to a secret society called Quill and Dagger, the membership of which includes Paul Wolfowitz, Sandy Berger, and Stephen Hadley. Wolfowitz, the neocon Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, was the author in 1992 of the Wolfowitz Doctrine of preemptive warfare. He also made comments about a surprise-like Pearl Harbor months before 9/11 and met with Pakistani ISI General Mahmoud Ahmed in the week before 9/11.
The PNAC letter to President Clinton in 1998, Paul Wolfowitz wrote, "The policy of containment of Saddam Hussein has been steadily eroding over the past several months. As recent events has demonstrated, we can no longer depend on our partners in the Gulf War Coalition to continue to uphold sanctions or punish Saddam when he blocks or invades UN inspectors. Our ability to ensure that Saddam Hussein is not producing weapons of mass destruction, therefore, has substantially diminished. Even if full inspections were eventually to resume, which now seems highly unlikely, experience has shown that it is difficult, if not impossible, to monitor Iraq's chemical and biological production. The lengthy period during which the inspectors have been unable to enter many Iraqi facilities has made it even less likely that they will be able to uncover all of Saddam's secrets. As a result, in the not too distant future, remember this is 1998, in the not too distant future, we will be unable to determine with any reasonable level of confidence whether Iraq does or does not possess such weapons." Notice how he assumes that he has them and that there are secrets and that they're just unable to find them now. He's starting with a conclusion and supporting it with scare tactics. They even use the same catchphrases. Weapons of mass destruction. Because it's not like the U.S. has or sells any of those. And avoiding inspectors. Of course, Paul Wolfowitz never offered any evidence for the claims he was making, and he would flip-flop his rationales for a war in Iraq so long as a war in Iraq happened. And when he was finally cornered and questioned about it, his only way out, of course, was to evoke 9/11 and hope that by repeating 9/11 enough times, it would be enough emotional smoke in the room for him to worm away and not have to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, gentlemen. As you can see, a lot of the questions here relate to the high cost of the war, not only in resources, but in human lives, of course. And I'd like to get at the key question of what we're really doing there. And, of course, in the months leading up to the war, there was a steady drumbeat of weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. And Secretary Wolfowitz, in your almost hour-long testimony here this morning, only once did you mention weapons of mass destruction, and that was an ad lib. I don't think it's in any of your written testimony. So now we're in this endeavor, huge cost not only in resources but in lives. So I'll ask the question, Secretary Wolfowitz, give you a chance. What are we doing there?
Senator Chafee, what we have done there is to remove a regime that was a threat to the United States. We've said all along, if you go back to Secretary Powell's presentation to the United Nations, all three of those concerns were stated very clearly. The concern about weapons of mass destruction, the concern about Saddam's links to terrorism, which are there, not as clear as the case on weapons
Secretary,
of mass
just
destruction.
interrupt. I'm a cynic. So when you make these assertions, give some proof. A threat to the United States, how?
I'd suggest go back and read, if you want to give me an hour, we can have a different kind of hearing, but if you go back and read Secretary Powell's testimony, it is very clear. And it is the concern that the combination of weapons of mass destruction and terrorists.
What the claims were, he asked, what's the proof for those claims? We all know what Powell said. We all know what the claims were. Powell restated the stuff that you said, and you're a liar. Where's the proof for weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism? All Wolfowitz can do is say, well, Colin Powell said it too. And, of course, 9/11, 9/11, 9/11.
Poses a kind of threat which maybe 10 years ago we would have thought we could live with. And I would have said 10 years ago my whole view about Iraq would have been very different. 10 years ago I would have said Iraq, as terrible as it is a problem of the Iraqi people. I said all along I believe we should have given those people more help in getting rid of that tyrant. But September 11th put it in a different light, and taking on that tyrant forcefully meant, in fact, if anything, that we had to take that threat more seriously. So all three of those concerns are stated in Secretary Powell's testimony. I talked about the mistreatment of the people.
Could I interrupt because my time is limited, unfortunately. You just said that this is that 10 years ago you wouldn't have agreed to a regime change. However, in 1998, you as a member of the New American Century sent a letter to President
Senator,
Clinton.
I said something different.
No, wait a sec. You were saying we're seeing it in the light of September 11th. That's just not true. You've been advocating for regime change all through the late 90s. And in this letter,
Can I explain? There's a very clear
strategy should aim, above all, this is 1998, the strategy should aim, above all, at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power. You signed that letter.
Senator, there's a very big difference. I was very clear. I don't know if it's in that letter, but elsewhere, I never thought before September 11th that we should use tens of thousands of American troops to do the job for the Iraqis. I never thought we should go to Baghdad, even at the end of the Gulf War, when I thought we should have done some other things we didn't do. I thought up until September 11th that our job was to help the Iraqi people. I think the mistake we made in 1991 was they rose up against Saddam. They got no help from us. September 11th changed the stakes, in my view, for the United States and made it a different matter in terms of using American troops. The end is the same, but you're not distinguishing the means, and the means are absolutely crucial. Putting American troops' lives at stake is something that we do when our security is threatened. Our security was threatened. The troops out there, I think, understand that it is threatened. I think they understand that they're part of fighting the war on terrorism as we go on today, and that is important.
I'll just finish up by saying I really resent when witnesses talk that this is in the light of September 11th when the evidence is to the contrary.
Senator, you're misrepresenting what I said in that letter.
You have over and over again through the late 90s urged regime change in Iraq.
Can I try again then, since I believe you're not representing my views properly? It is true. I thought from the end of the Gulf War up until September 11th of 2001 that it was important for the United States to help Iraqis get rid of that regime, and that is a policy of regime change. But I did not believe that it was either necessary or justified to use large-scale American military forces to do that job. At the end of the Gulf War, all it would have taken was a minimum application of U.S. air power and some of the artillery that were sitting on the south bank of the Euphrates River. September 11th changed the stakes for us, in my view, dramatically, and it changed the whole way of looking at an uncertain but still disturbing threat of the combination of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism.
Berger, the national security advisor to President Clinton, was later caught stealing documents from the 9/11 Commission investigation. Berger was also the boss of White House counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke, and together with Hadley, who was Condoleezza Rice's deputy, was responsible for delaying or obstructing Clarke's plans to stop al-Qaeda in January of 2001.
Months after 9/11, Israel was caught spying again on the United States through Department of Defense employee Lawrence Franklin, who worked out of an office which met with Israeli generals and was run by Douglas Feith, another PNAC author. Fife is a profiteer whose company, Fife & Zell, is partners with an Israeli settler, Mark Zell. The law firm got to delegate reconstruction contracts in Iraq. The Israelis were visiting the Department of Defense without having to sign in and going straight to Fife's office, where the secretive Office of Special Plans was headed. The same office Larry Franklin worked for, who was sentenced to 12 years in jail for spying for AIPAC, the Israeli lobby. Why were Israeli generals visiting a secretive group under the Office of the Clean Break and PNAC authors, where an Israeli spy was also caught red-handed? And none of it ever made the news media. In fact, normal intelligence channels weren't even aware that Fife's secret office existed.
I'd have to interject something similar to what I said to Senator Feinstein. To a lot of the analysts working these issues, we weren't aware of what was going on up there, whether it was the vice president or somebody else. To give you an illustration, I didn't even know about the existence of the Fife office in the Pentagon until maybe 6-7 months before the war. And the way I found out about the existence of Mr. Fife's office, because somebody who worked on terrorism in our bureau showed me a product produced by that office. As I recall, it was 2 pages long. And it was the evidence linking Iraq with terrorism. And the person was giving it to me effectively as comic relief, saying, "Can you believe what's on this paper?" It was as if I had gotten my morning traffic someday, because there's a lot of junk in intelligence that the analyst knows that has to be sifted out to get to the real kernels, and it looked like an unsorted pile of junk. And this is one reason the Fife office, which does relate to the Secretary of Defense and then to others, becomes extremely important. I didn't go into it in what I read here. It's in my written testimony. Those kinds of nodes and offices must be completely eliminated because people aren't even aware of them. There aren't standard communications between them and the rest of the intelligence community. And more importantly, there has been no vetting of their personnel, whatsoever for professionalism, for experience in that field. That office basically was writing intelligence, which was getting far more attention than a lot of what Carl and I, were working on, and yet it had none of the professional standards, that it applied to the rest of the intelligence community. And it was so low profile, if you didn't know what was going on behind the scenes, to many of us it was utterly invisible until the last moments.
Congressman Jones, if I can extend what Wayne White mentioned with regard to the detached nature of some of what was going on in the Office of Secretary of Defense and Office of Vice President, what this little group under Mr. Fife was doing and trying to come up with all the scraps, trying to show a link with Al-Qaeda, they did put together a briefing, which was briefed out at Langley to Mr. Tennant and to members of the Counterterrorist Center. Again, I wasn't working on counterterrorism at the time. I didn't receive the briefing. That group wasn't established because the intelligence community wasn't doing its job. It was doing its job rather intensively and devoting a great deal of effort, particularly the Counterterrorist Center, again, I wasn't in it at the time, to this whole issue of Iraq and Al-Qaeda because they were asked so many questions again and again and again and again and again. So they wrote a bunch of papers. It wasn't that they didn't do the good analysis or come up with the specific evidence. It's that the policymakers, these particular ones in the Office of Secretary of Defense, didn't like the answer. And the answer was, there's no alliance. And that was a very well-documented answer. And there was a lot of other information that pointed in an opposite direction from all these scraps that Mr. Fife's office put together and we later read about in the Weekly Standard. Evidence that showed, for example, that there was not training going on, that there were not contacts between Iraq and just about any Islamist you could come up with in Afghanistan. That was all the other side that was ignored.
Fife's office was passing classified information to Israel through AIPAC employees Keith Wiseman and Steve Rosen. The man passing the documents, Lawrence Franklin, was sentenced, but the people receiving the information didn't get in any trouble after threatening to narc on everyone else who was involved, which included the majority of the Bush administration. Doug Fife, working under the Zionist madman, the Prince of Darkness, Richard Pearl, ran a special office in the Department of Defense called the Office of Special Plans. Oh, he was special, all right. The OSP had a mirror group in Israel and both met with Israeli generals. Fife's special cabal did a lot worse than cherry-pick intelligence. They flat out fabricated it.
The most frequent and damaging charge has been that Feith used his Pentagon office to produce alternative intelligence reports that link Saddam to al-Qaeda, then passed them on to the White House. Some of it, like a report that 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta met with Iraqi intelligence in Prague, has been widely discredited.
One of the reasons people were told we were going to war in Iraq was because an imminent attack with weapons of mass destruction was about to happen.
I don't believe anybody in the U.S. government said that.
This is Donald Rumsfeld. Iraq poses a serious and mounting threat to our country.
No terrorist state poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people and the stability of the world than the regime of Saddam Hussein.
The Iraqi regime is a threat to any American.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Feith's office took PNAC's old lies as well as their new lies and presented them as intelligence. These were not mistakes, they were deceptions. PNAC wrote the script. To understand why, I drive home the point that PNAC was the central hub for creating a case for war in Iraq. Just have a look at some of their policy papers. These quotes are in their own words from their own website, and the authors, who also wrote Israeli policy papers stating the same things, wrote exactly what became the free invasion rhetoric to invade Iraq. Feith with Pearl set up something called IAI, International Advisors Incorporated, in Turkey to act as a miniature ATC. Feith was his sole shareholder. It is essentially just another bubble to profiteer through. It's odd how the U.S. wrongly points his finger at Iraq, and even Iran, accusing them of building nuclear weapons, and yet the real criminals trading nuclear secrets and possibly nuclear material are right here in our own government. Our Undersecretary of State and former ambassador to Turkey, Mark Grossman, is implicated in just such a crime. And even though he'd been caught red-handed with these dealings with the Turks and the Israelis, nothing could be done about it because the whistleblowers were gagged. To quote an old write-up from Justin Raimondo, one of the best muckrakers out there, immediately after 9/11, the FBI arrested a bunch of people suspected of being involved with the attacks, including 4 associates of key targets of FBI counterintelligence operations. Sibel heard the targets tell Mark Grossman, "We need to get them out of the U.S. because we can't afford them to spill the beans." Grossman duly facilitated their release from jail, and the suspects immediately left the country without further investigation or interrogation. That's the number 3 man at the State Department facilitating the immediate release of 9/11 suspects at the request of targets of the FBI's investigation. It would be Mark Grossman who warned his associates to stay away from Brewster Jennings, a front for the CIA, particularly the wing that Valerie Plame was working for, which worked on tracking nuclear weapons proliferation. This became more public knowledge when Novak and Louis Libby told the world to stay away from Brewster Jennings and associates by ousting Valerie Plame as a covert agent. By ousting her, it was easy to deduce that the company she worked for must have been a front, and thus all of the CIA agents working for that were gone. They're pointing the finger at Iraq and Iran, but we know which country in the Middle East secretly has nukes. We know which cabal within the United States is selling this information on the black market, and it's in our own government. It's Feith and Pearl and Grossman and the same PNAC Zionist traitors that have led to the war in Iraq, helped cover it up in Niger, ousted Valerie Plame, and blackmailed politicians for their own financial interests. Israel's ability to completely control coverage of its crimes is important. 9/11 was immediately falsely linked to Iraq by Israel, and as you will see, the pre-invasion hype, the anthrax attacks, spies, and even 9/11 itself all link back to Israel. However, the U.S. was a willing partner. The U.S. wasn't fooled. It was fed a pretext, which it eagerly accepted. The plans for war, the Patriot Act, and massive profiteering had already been made and decided for years. The war in Iraq wasn't based on mistaken intelligence. It was based on lies, known deceptions.
The power structure used that unity to pass nightmarish legislation, beginning with the Patriot Act, which was written before 9/11.
9/11 was the new Pearl Harbor event the neocons yearned for, and it was 9/11 that acted as the catalyst for both war and sweeping pre-written legislation to create a security panic state, which stripped away civil liberties and constitutional rights for the sake of the military-industrial complex.
Homeland Security was in place prior to 9/11 as well.
Another piece of this, which is something that has been well known to you all, is that the creation of the Office of Homeland Security was something that was planned even before September 11th.
While an international intelligence cartel wages psychological warfare against we the people.
And remember, this is a government that over the years has proven that it can be trusted with these powers.
You'd hope, as you mentioned before, that people don't complain about these extra inconveniences because they are simply being put into effect to protect all of us.
The creation of the Department of Homeland Security, briefly called the Office of Homeland Security, an executive post-9/11 spawn before the Homeland Security Act passed later to make it officially and legally more legitimate, quietly incorporated FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, under its wing. FEMA was responsible for the 9/11 cleanup. Oddly, they were positioned in New York September 10th, the night before the attacks.
To be honest with you, we arrived on late Monday night and went into action on Tuesday morning. And not until today did we get a full opportunity to work the entire site other than the spot at Church and Day to which we were deployed.
It's important to look at the events before, during, and after 9/11 in order to understand it. It is also important to look at who was chosen to investigate it. Two huge bills were created which have forever changed America: the Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The Congress passed these monsters while it was under the duress of an anthrax attack. It is clear that Israeli firsters within the U.S. falsely linked Iraq to the 9/11 attacks. This would be done so again in the letters for the anthrax attacks, which were also initially blamed on Al-Qaeda.
After 9/11, a climate of fear was created in order to shut down any opposition to the Bush administration's new agenda. A week after 9/11, anthrax began appearing in the mail. The letters were made to look as though they were the work of Muslim extremists.
The notes sent with the anthrax read, "Death to America, death to Israel," automatically associating Israel's enemies with America's enemies. Just in case you forgot it was Muslims from 9/11, they also wrote, "Allah is great," and 9/11-2001 as well.
Now, if you remember, these anthrax letters, they were written to appear to be from semi-literate Muslims. Very crude handwriting, all of this, all of that. They really do look more like movie prop letters than real letters.
The targets were government buildings, media outlets such as CBS, NBC, the New York Post, and politicians such as Senator Daschle and Leahy.
The anthrax is key. This connected Iraq to Al-Qaeda, and it's the reason many well-intentioned Americans signed up to fight Iraq, believing that they attacked America.
But here you have the Johnny Appleseed of terrorism wandering the country with his little sack of anthrax. 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 Anthrax.
Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax. Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax. Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax. Anthrax.
Anthrax.
Anthrax. Anthrax.
This was the ammo the U.S. used to frighten its own Congress and scare the United Nations. One must remember at this time, the mass media had the public whipped up into a frenzy, scrambling for duct tape and storing food supplies. The press made an attack seem imminent, and the sloganeering for jack-off missile Johnny Tice became, "We gotta get them over there before they get us here." Let me explain the anthrax attacks with a cartoon I made. On September 18th, 2 anthrax letters were mailed. Both came from New Jersey. One had the "Death to America" and "Death to Israel" letter inside of it, and it was addressed to Tom Brokaw of NBC. This wouldn't be opened until October 12th. The other letter was sent to a New York Post editor and would not be opened until October 17th. 2 days later, still without any letters having been opened yet, on September 20th, 3 letters were mailed. 2 of them were hoax letters sent from Florida. One was to Howard Troxler and the other was to Judith Miller. Troxler opened his on October 9th, Miller opened hers on October 12th. These were hoax letters. However, the written letter inside had the same rhetoric as the second letter to Tom Brokaw. The second letter to Tom Brokaw also came on September 20th and was opened on October 5th. On September 26th, still, no letters have been opened, no reports have been made. Philip Zack, somebody who got caught stealing anthrax from a lab in Maryland, sends a letter to the Justice Department blaming Ayad Assad. That letter is opened on October 2nd.
There was another story that the media absolutely would not touch the story of Dr. Philip Zach. And it goes back to the U.S. government lab where the anthrax was stored. It was reported that official U.S. government documents in the anthrax investigation showed that Dr. Zach had entered the laboratory where the anthrax used in the letters was kept without proper authorization after having lost his job.
How this person knew about anthrax attacks and who to blame it on is a mystery because there hadn't been any reporting on the anthrax attacks yet. Also on October 2nd, the Patriot Act is introduced, and it is opposed by Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy, who are in position to prevent it from passing. Leahy is the chairman of the Judicial Committee and can block the bill. Daschle is also in a position to block the bill. Daschle and Leahy opposed the Patriot Act on October 6th, and sometime between October 6th and 9th, we can't be sure because the 7th was Sunday and the 8th was Columbus Day, anthrax was mailed to Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. Daschle would open his letter on October 15th, and Leahy's, because it was misrouted, would not be opened until November. Of all the possible targets, the two men chosen were Senator Tom Daschle and wanted to create an independent investigation into 9/11, and the other was Senator Leahy of the Leahy Amendment to the FOAA, which, if enforced, would end all military aid to Israel. The anthrax sent to Leahy was the most dangerous. They are made of smaller granules and of uniform size than the Daschle letter, far more powerful than all the other mailings. And according to Newsweek, the anthrax letter to Leahy was coated with a chemical compound unknown to experts who have worked in the field for years. The coating matches no known anthrax samples ever recorded from the biological weapons producers anywhere in the world, including Iraq and the former Soviet Union. At least one other anthrax letter had been mailed about September 21st or 23rd. They're not sure because it had already been opened and was in the bag of mail and contaminated all the rest of the letters, so they don't have a clear postmark. Around that date, it gets open in October 3rd, causes several people to get sick, and on October 4th, Robert Stephen dies from anthrax, the first person to die from anthrax in the U.S. since the 1970s. And on October 5th, it is reported in the news. This is the first report in the news about the anthrax. A hoax anthrax letter was also mailed to NBC News from Florida, September 20th, just 2 days after anthrax had been mailed from New Jersey, also to NBC News. It was postmarked September 18th. Thus, these were not copycat attacks. The senders had to have had knowledge of the initial attacks as well as the notes therein. It appeared at first the work of remaining Al-Qaeda cells. James Woolsey, Judith Miller, Gary Schmidt, Robert Kagan, William Crystal will all be blaming it on Iraq. On October 15th, John McCain will go on David Letterman, associating Iraq to Al-Qaeda.
If I could just mention very quickly, the second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I emphasize may, have come from Iraq.
The Bush administration was sold on the Iraqi anthrax connection, even when the FBI and the scientific community were not. The window of time was closing. Stephen Hatfield became a person of interest. Two groups went berserk trying to blame him, the JDO and the JDL. Hatfield has since been found innocent, but back in November of 2001, when Hatfield was in England, a hoax anthrax letter was sent to Senator Tom Daschle from the UK at the time when Hatfield was there. Was someone trying to frame him? This was again the same senator who had been sent actual anthrax just a month earlier. One Don Foster of Vanity Fair went out of his way to implicate Hatfield in the anthrax attacks, noting the movements of where Hatfield was, followed by the hoax anthrax letters. Tracing back into the 90s, a letter sent to Benai Britt from Kansas monitored Hatfield's movements, as well as another supposed letter sent from the Washington, D.C. area while he was there, and then another in England while he was there. And yet, he wasn't in New Jersey or Florida when those were sent.
It was not something smuggled in from Iraq. It was not something smuggled in from any Middle Eastern country. It was U.S. government ultrafine granulated weaponized anthrax spores.
The History Channel will now admit that the anthrax was U.S. made and came from inside.
Within weeks, 5 would be dead and thousands of others exposed to one of the deadliest bacteria known to man.
There are very few people who have the bench skills to make a product this good.
federal investigators discovered clues to the perpetrator's identity encoded in the bacterium itself.
There are 89 different types of anthrax, but each one has its own kind of trail. This one led directly back to our own defense establishment.
Was the U.S. government hiding a terrorist inside America's biodefense community? Some say yes, and that the official government investigation was a sham.
The only people who know anything about the subject are also the suspects.
They're protecting this individual.
What we're dealing with here is an inside job with a real insider who has secrets that nobody wants to get out. It's going to be too humiliating, too embarrassing.
All the spores were sent for immediate forensic testing. By the 10th of October, the analysis of the spores was complete. The results were horrifying. The bacterium that killed Robert Stevens and eventually infected 7 of his colleagues was identified as the Ames strain, a strain long favored by and under the near total control of the U.S. biodefense program.
In August 2008, finally a member of the mass media, Keith Olbermann, admits and clarifies for the public that the anthrax was not from Al-Qaeda.
Good evening. This is Friday, August 1st, 95 days until the 2008 presidential election. To that topic presently. First, if reporting by the Los Angeles Times today is even remotely accurate, the questions about the anthrax attacks, which terrified this nation late in 2001, would seem tonight to have boiled down to 3. First, was the anthrax sent by just one employee of our own government or more than one employee of our own government? Was it incompetence or a cover-up? And third, how, if there was evidence of something askew at our biological warfare lab in Maryland as early as December 2001, why did national news organizations in this country receive supposedly reliable leaks from the Bush administration that the anthrax had originated in Iraq? Our 5th story in the countdown, there is finally a suspect in the anthrax attacks. He worked for the government's anthrax lab, and unfortunately he's dead as of this past Tuesday. His name was Dr. Bruce E. Ivins. The Los Angeles Times reporting this morning, NBC News confirming tonight, that the Justice Department was preparing to file criminal charges against him for the 2001 anthrax attacks.
The FBI ordered the Ames strain destroyed and then went on a wild goose chase through different suspects who'd been pegged by the ADL and ultimately landed on a guy, Bruce Ivins, who had an odd suicide, overdosing on Tylenol. Later evidence shows he could not have made the anthrax from his lab.
Killing those senators or scaring them into changing their vote would benefit who more? The security state, which had pre-written the bill and already planned the wars, or the lowly lab technician acting all by himself? It is interesting that they were mailed from the same states as Al-Qaeda's hijackers. Did someone know ahead of time where they were? The letters did read Allah is great and death to Israel. They came on the heels of 9/11, so naturally people assumed it was Al-Qaeda. Then anthrax or hoax anthrax was sent from Florida and New Jersey, just miles from where Al-Qaeda was based. Is this the work of a lone scientist? Who would benefit? Who else was located in both places and has a reputation for false flag terrorism? The Israeli Mossad.
Carl, is there any reason to suspect in this instance that the Israeli government is involved?
No, there's not, but there are growing instincts and an awful lot of law enforcement officials in a variety of agencies who suspect that and have begun compiling evidence and a highly classified investigation into precisely that possibility.
They have the means, the motive, and they were there.
Somehow the Bush administration would have the foresight to be on Cipro 6 weeks prior to the attacks. How convenient. An attack traced back to U.S. government facilities, and the president and his staff happen to be taking the antidote before it's even in the mail. Judicial Watch would file suit against the administration for its actions.
Well, this is another good example of how certain people consider themselves to be above the rest of us. On September 11th, I think it'll come as a shock to a lot of people, but it's been reported by the New York Times and other major news organizations and confirmed by the White House. The President's office and Vice President's office went on Cipro, the antibiotic that was used to combat anthrax. The White House went on Cipro. It must have known that either an attack was underway or was imminent. It shows you
that some people in this country are less than equal and are not treated like the political elite. So.
And on the morning of 9/11, just as the attacks were happening, Hauer instructed the entire White House staff to go on Cipro, the anti-anthrax drug. Now, how did he know anthrax was going to become an issue? Well, as fate would have it, Hauer worked in 1999 with Stephen Hatfield, the prime suspect in the anthrax attacks, at the Scientific Applications International Corporation, the SAIC. This company, the SAIC, was awarded a huge biodefense contract after 9/11. Hatfield, a well-known friend of Jerome Hauer, was working on the military-grade anthrax program at U.S. AMRID, Fort Detrick, Maryland.
In addition to being managing director for Kroll, Jerome Hauer was the national security advisor with the National Institute of Health, which managed the government response to the anthrax attacks shortly after 9/11.
However, Israeli firsters were unable to get their war until they could create the myth of Saddam's men meeting with Al-Qaeda, using moles in the media to repeat the garbage of their own publications, which is exactly what they did. Not only that, but they compounded on that lie by adding that at this meeting they also got anthrax from the Iraqis, and they blamed that on Al-Qaeda as well, all of which turned out to be lies. Of course, the Prince of Darkness was a message force multiplier. December 28, 2001, in an op-ed in the New York Times, Richard Pearl wrote, "We must strike Iraq. Evidence of a meeting in Prague between a senior Iraqi intelligence agent and Mohammed Atta, the September 11th ringleader, is convincing." Another PNAC troll, Paul Wolfowitz, added, "Like the meeting of Mohammed Atta with Iraqi officials in Prague, I think the premise of a policy has to be we can't afford to wait for proof beyond a reasonable doubt." February 23, 2002, in the San Francisco Chronicle. Pearl was the chairman of the Defense Policy Board in the DoD and involved in too many other criminal activities to get into. Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense and later the head of the World Bank, and also involved in too many crimes to get into. The London Times reports October 27th, not only did Iraqis meet with Al-Qaeda's Mohammed Atta in Prague, they were also seen giving him a vial of anthrax. Israeli security forces observed the transfer. The author of the London Times piece later had a mysterious death. Mass media quickly seized on an Iraqi anthrax connection as well as an Al-Qaeda connection. It is also easy to see how this complements Judith Miller's stories of biolabs and Cheney's stories about a meeting in Prague, both 100% false. With this lie, they connected 9/11 to Iraq. Yet there was no meeting in Prague. There were no Iraqis passing anthrax to hijackers. There were no Iraqis even talking to hijackers. These monstrous lies were told by embedded Zionist journalists who worked with the administration's PNAC members. For example, the lie that the lead hijacker of 9/11, Mohammed Atta, met with agents of Saddam was repeated by William Safire of the New York Times, May 9, 2002, which came from PNAC's Gary Schmidt, who wrote in 2001 for the Weekly Standard, an outfit run by PNAC's co-founders Crystal and Kagan. The story was leaked to Rutgers September 18, 2001, just a week after 9/11, and the same day as the first anthrax mailing. Wow! They knew about the lead hijacker as well as a meeting that never took place within 7 days. They probably wanted to follow up on this sooner than they did, adding the anthrax part of the lie, assuming the first letter would be opened in just a couple of days, but the mail didn't work like that. This Atta met with Iraqi intelligence lie was repeated by Vice President Dick Cheney December 9, 2001 on national television. He later denied it in spite of being on tape saying it.
You have said in the past that it was, quote, pretty well confirmed.
No, I never said that.
Okay. I
never
think
said
that is...
No, it's absolutely not. What I said was, it's been pretty well confirmed that he did go to Prague and he did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service in Czechoslovakia last April.
We've never made the case or argued the case that somehow Osama bin Laden was directly involved in 9/11. That evidence has never been forthcoming.
Look at just some of the lies coming from a couple of PNAC goons, Gary Schmidt and William Crystal. Both wrote pieces called Iraq Al-Qaeda Connection, trying to link Iraq to Al-Qaeda. Gary Schmidt referred to Fred Barnes from the Weekly Standard, saying that the Czechs had given him a photograph of Atta meeting in Prague with Iraqi officials. They kept repeating this line again about the Prague meeting between Mohammed Atta and Iraqis. Fred Barnes wrote a piece called Mohammed Atta Was Here, in which he accused the meeting of happening and having photographic evidence for it, as well as alluding concluding that the Iraqis may have passed biological, chemical, or even nuclear weapons to Al-Qaeda. Of course, no such photo existed, because Atta was never there, and the Iraqis had no biological or chemical weapons to give. Gary Schmidt of PNAC wrote, shortly before getting on a plane to fly to New Jersey from Europe in June 2000, Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker of the first jet airliner to slam into the World Trade Center, and apparently the lead conspirator in the attacks of September 11th, met with a senior Iraqi intelligence official. This was no chance encounter. Rather than take a flight from Germany, where he had been living, Atta traveled to Prague, almost certainly for the purpose of meeting there with Iraqi intelligence operatives Ahmad Samir Ahani. This was a complete lie designed to connect Al-Qaeda to Iraq and thus Iraq to the 9/11 attacks. It was false. Yet all the corporate news networks repeated it anyway because it had been in the New York Times. This lie came from Judith Miller, who wrote about it in the New York Times. Judith Miller, the girlfriend of the lawyer for the Mossad, Louis Libby. She made up the lie about Iraq's aluminum tubes allegedly being used as centrifuges in a nuclear reactor. December 20th, 2001. She said that she heard about secret weapons of mass destruction labs hidden underneath the palaces of Saddam. She bolsters her report by citing first Paul Wolfowitz and then Richard Pearl, and she even went as far as trying to rope in Syria to the weapons of mass destruction myth by sourcing Israeli intelligence. You know how that happens? That's because the OSP and the DoD with Pearl is actually a mirror group of the Israeli cabal and the Knesset. They're all saying the same BS, and she is just a media whore mouthpiece for this neocon propaganda about Iraq. Never mind the fact that that wouldn't physically work anyway if it was true. To recap, she retold an older PNAC lie and then added that Syria was involved in it and quoted Wolfowitz, Pearl, and Israel. Here's a woman who claimed that Iraq was using mobile weapons labs to hide their biological weapons of mass destruction and was capable of producing anthrax. Remember, Miller was also a journalist who got a hoax letter of anthrax. It's interesting because the postmark on these letters, which had identical notes as the real anthrax letters, were sent before there was reporting about them, as they had not been received yet. So why would warmongering Judith Miller and Fox News be sent pretend attacks, and yet real anthrax was sent to others who opposed the Patriot Act and the war? Judith Miller, despite having gone to jail for 85 days for some of her lies, gets hired by Fox News. Paul Wolfowitz, the idiot who said that Iraq's oil revenue would pay for the cost of the war within 2 years, gets rewarded for that economic blunder by being appointed head of the World Bank. Later, neocons involved in the American-Turkish Council and the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee were fingered in illegal black market weapons trades, including nuclear material. AIPAC was also caught spying on the United States, again. One of its moles, Larry Franklin, who was sentenced to 12 years in jail, was involved with the Niger forgeries, a bit of nuclear weapons propaganda, which fit nicely with Judith Miller's tubes myth. If you don't know already, if you've been living in a cave or getting all your news from TV, these forgers were so bad that they didn't even fake the right name on the document and ignorantly used the name of an obsolete foreign minister who had not been in power for over a decade. It would be the equivalent of trying to pass off a modern document today and signing it Ronald Reagan. This bogus information was used anyway, despite being debunked immediately, even by our own CIA. They knew it wasn't true. The CIA is evil, but they're not stupid. But it didn't matter, and they knew it wasn't going to matter. The press never took the 20 seconds or so that I just did to explain this. All in one, you see the imperialists' intentional deception and sloppiness with the media's yes-man partnership. They can't claim incompetence when they're the ones faking the documents, and the media can't claim ignorance when they will not report on the matter even after the fact. They lie to you together. The mass media is just a pro-war PR machine for the Pentagon. Sybil Edmonds, the translator for the FBI, had the state secrets privilege enacted on her as a gag order. Every step has been taken to silence investigation, information, and legal action into these crimes.
Confirmation of these allegations against Israel would finally come in January of 2008, when the Times Online would tell FBI whistleblower Sybil Edmonds' story. This Turkish translator for the FBI found an international spy ring that included Israel, Turkey, and Pakistan working with household names within the United States. Edmonds stated that one high-level official was aiding foreign operatives against U.S. interests. by passing them highly classified information, not only from the State Department, but also from the Pentagon, in exchange for money, position, and political objectives. The article stated that the Turks and Israelis had planted moles in military and academic institutions which handled nuclear technology.
Sibel Edmonds uncovered that condemning foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks was missed by the FBI. Of course, it's not hard to miss when you're not even looking. Rather than investigating her findings, her superiors at the FBI covered it up, and she was released. One document in particular of recorded conversations she uncovered shed more light about the full scale of the 9/11 attack in New York. In July of 2001, 2 months before 9/11, suspects were having blueprints of skyscrapers sent by courier to an obscure region west of Baluchistan. Not only blueprints for skyscrapers, but also building and bridge plans and composites. Details are in her book Classified Woman. Not only were they interested in the buildings, but also a bridge. This fits with the people who had fake passes in the World Trade Centers, as well as those who were in a van full of bombs at the George Washington Bridge. It's also similar to the botched 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which consisted of a truck bomb at the towers and plans to blow up the Holland Tunnel.
J. Michael Springman worked for the United States government for 20 years with the Foreign Service and Consulate. He claimed that the CIA was overriding visa decisions made in Saudi Arabia and protecting al-Qaeda operatives in getting them to the United States to be trained and have returned for covert programs in the Middle East.
I began with the federal government in 1969, taking a job in the Bureau of International Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. While I was there, I had been working my way through the International Trade Administration.
Well, it began in Jeddah when I was repeatedly told to issue visas to unqualified applicants. This went on for quite some time during most of my tour there. Under the American immigration laws, you need to demonstrate that you're going to the United States for a specific purpose. And typically, in such a situation, you're going to sign a business deal, or you're going to go as a tourist to see the Grand Canyon, or you're going to the United States as a student to study a particular course of study. And these were people that had no job in one instance. He was a Sudanese who was unemployed in Saudi Arabia and a refugee from the Sudan. But he got a visa for national security purposes after it was taken out of my hands by the chief of the consular section. At basis, though, I really think that these were more CIA assets, people that were recruited, like all of the folks I've been issuing visas to a couple of years previously. And these people were tools to be done for a job. Well, the visas issued to the hijackers in Jeddah came about as a result of it being a CIA consulate. It was the 5th largest visa issuing post in the Middle East. It was pretty much a closed system, and they simply brought them through there, knowing that they would be protected by the agency, that people would get their visas, or if they didn't get their visas, they could be made to be given visas.
15 of the hijackers were in the United States on visas obtained from a program in Saudi Arabia. Only 3 of them were interviewed by a consular official. The Visas Express program started in June 2001 and allowed visas to be given automatically without interviews or background checks. The program was initiated only in Saudi Arabia, which is a nation known to have a large population of animosity towards the United States, which is sympathetic to the nation's own native, Osama bin Laden. This visa program was only introduced in Saudi Arabia, while no other such privilege was or has ever been extended to any of the allies or Western European friends of the United States. Michael Springman blew the whistle and stated that State Department officials were issuing visas to terrorists, which he knew were terrorists, but he was being gagged.
The 19 hijackers were able to get into the United States despite information on their travel documents that should have raised some big red flags. Could it happen again? Here's NBC Justice Department correspondent Pete Williamson.
It's a myth, the report says, that all the 19 hijackers entered the U.S. legally.
Some clearly did, like hijacker leader Mohammed Atta, whose actual visa is shown publicly for the first time. But 3 of the hijackers on board the plane that crashed into the Pentagon had on their visa applications what the report calls indicators of Islamic extremism linked to al-Qaeda. The 3 were Khalid al-Midar, Salem al-Hazmi, whose state-issued ID cards are shown here, and al-Hazmi's brother Nawaf. Of the actual hijacker passports, only this burned fragment of Ziad Jarrah's is shown, recovered from the wreckage of Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania. But the report says when 2 other hijackers applied for their visas, their documents contained another warning sign: phony travel stamps intended to cover up their travel to Afghanistan to attend terror training camps.
Even though there'd been the bombings in 95, 96, 98, 2000, all involving Saudis, no one asked for a national intelligence estimate if Saudi Arabia is a new terrorist state.
Once I got back to the United States and was out of the Foreign Service, I ran across a couple of people with ties to the American government that told me another story, that the CIA was recruiting fighters for the Afghan war against the then Soviets, and that their asset, Osama bin Laden, was working with them. The relationship between bin Laden and the CIA was essentially, he was one of their assets, one of the people they could turn to for help if they had questions. If they wanted somebody recruited, if they wanted somebody sent somewhere, if they wanted information, if they wanted something done, they went to bin Laden.
Bin Laden isn't wanted by the FBI, and he was on a CIA payroll? Is he the brutal Islamic terrorist we have been led to believe, or a mere frontman?
Even if al-Qaeda did this, our government is still guilty. Then you should remember that al-Qaeda was supported and funded by the ISI, and the ISI was supported and funded by the CIA.
The day after the attacks, it was apparent that some people within the government were aware of the Pakistani funding of al-Qaeda.
Secretary Powell, one country you didn't mention was Pakistan, and I understand that your deputy has spoken with the ambassador to Pakistan.
Deputy Secretary Armitage did meet with Pakistani officials today. It would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level how helpful they might be if we find a basis to act upon that information.
By then, the Bush administration knew that despite years of Saudi reassurance, 15 of the 19 hijackers had been Saudi nationals. So in the terrible aftermath of September 11th, surely it was now time to track down those who provided money and support for 9/11 wherever they might be. Right? Wrong again, according to former CIA insider Robert Baer. When George W. Bush says, terrorists, those who harbor them, those who give support to them, are our enemies.
That's obviously not true, because everybody that financed September 11th is currently in Saudi Arabia and free. I mean, it would sort of like if bin Laden had said, well, you know, it's just a coincidence my guys happened to run into your towers. Are we just going to leave him alone?
Not all the money that financed the attacks came from Saudi Arabia, although the majority of it did. Not surprisingly, another source of the funding came from Pakistan. It was reported in the Times of India that a $100,000 wire transfer took place between Omar Sheikh, an ISI agent, and Mohammed Atta, ringleader of the 9/11 attacks. Omar Sheikh was ordered through the ISI to transfer the funds by the ISI chief, General Mahmoud Ahmed.
Suspected hijacker Mohammed Atta received wire transfers via Pakistan and then distributed the cash via money orders bought here in Florida. A senior law enforcement source tells CNN the man sending the money to Atta is believed to be Ahmed Umar Saeed Sheikh.
He reportedly is controlling certain aspects of the financial transactions of the Al-Qaeda network.
Once a standout student at the London School of Economics, the British-born son of Pakistani parents speaks 5 languages.
Ahmad Omar Saeed Sheikh, the ISI agent who wired the money to Mohammed Atta, had many aliases. The chief of the ISI who ordered the wire transfer to Mohammed Atta, General Mahmoud Ahmed, was actually visiting Washington the week of 9/11, arriving exactly 1 week before September 11th. The general met with Pentagon, White House, National Security Council, and CIA officials.
Are you aware of the reports at the time that ISI chief was in Washington on September 11 and on September 10th, $100,000 was wired from Pakistan to these groups here in this area. And why he was here, was meeting with you or anybody in the administration?
I have not seen that report, and he was certainly not meeting with me. Yes.
On the very morning of 9/11, General Mahmoud Ahmed, one of the financiers of the attacks, was at a breakfast meeting on Capitol Hill, hosted by Senator Bob Graham and Representative Porter Goss, the chairman of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. Now remember, Senator Bob Graham and Representative Porter Goss, who were warned by Dr. David Graham about the very clear Saudi and Pakistani involvement, and these two men are hosting a meeting with one of the financiers of the attack, Pakistani ISI chief, on the morning of the attacks, watching them take place together. And it was these two men that would later head the congressional inquiry with Nancy Pelosi that gave the public the official story of 9/11, and conveniently left the information out about these foreign governments. Senator Bob Graham stated he was surprised to see foreign governments involved in the attacks.
Also, I was surprised at the evidence that there were foreign governments involved in facilitating the activities of at least some of the terrorists in the United States. I am stunned that we have not done a better job of pursuing that to determine if other terrorists received similar support.
Are you suggesting that you are convinced that there was a state sponsor behind 9/11?
I think there is very compelling evidence that at least some of the terrorists were assisted, not just in financing, although that was part of it, by a sovereign foreign government, and that we have been derelict in our duty to track that down, make the further case, or find evidence that would indicate that that is not true, and we can look for other reasons why the terrorists were able to function so effectively in the United States.
The 9/11 Commission maintained that no foreign governments were involved in the attacks. What is the Pakistani connection, and why doesn't the public know more about it? Why does Bob Graham act so surprised when he was warned? Now remember, Porter Goss was also warned by Dr. David Graham. Is it just a coincidence that these were the only two men that were warned and also happened to be conveniently sitting aboard the congressional inquiry that investigated 9/11 that gave the public the official story? They sat in command of the congressional inquiry with Nancy Pelosi.
It took us 9 months to do all of our work, have our hearings, interview our witnesses, write the report, and it took 6 months for the administration to agree to some level of declassification. The report is overclassified. That is a disservice to the American people.
As for Omar Saeed Sheikh, he was found to be Pakistani ISI, the CIA's counterpart in Pakistan.
Arresting officer A.K. Jain says under questioning, Omar Sheikh admitted he was supported by the Pakistan government's intelligence service, the ISI.
He had told me that.
He admitted to you?
Oh, yes.
And after his release, it was very clear that he was provided protection and safe haven in Pakistan with the direct support, with the knowledge, and obviously with the connivance of the Pakistani intelligence.
How do I know the name Saeed?
Well, probably because he's one of the most infamous terrorists known to man. You may know him by another name, too, because he has about a half-dozen aliases. But his big claim to fame is his conviction for the kidnapping and murder of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl in February of 2002.
Daniel Pearl was killed by an ISI agent?
By the very man the government claims assisted in the 9/11 attacks. Pearl was on his way to meet Saeed when he disappeared. Saeed, using one of his aliases, knew that Pearl was investigating ISI ties to Al-Qaeda in 9/11.
I thought Pearl was killed because he was Jewish.
But it's far more likely he was killed by a high-ranking ISI agent to make sure he didn't print in a major U.S. newspaper ISI's connections to Al-Qaeda. See, from its inception, Al-Qaeda has been trained, funded, armed, and supported by the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI. The ISI, by its own disclosure, is an arm of the American CIA.
What is the importance of covering up Pakistan's role? Perhaps one should look back at 1979. The Pakistani ISI is the CIA's counterpart in Pakistan and was the CIA cutout which created, communicated, and financed the Mujahideen during the U.S. covert war with the Soviets in Afghanistan.
George Bush Sr. was the director when the CIA was preparing intelligence cells in Pakistan and Afghanistan to fight a proxy war of the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Call them modern privateers. It's worth it to take the time to explain what a privateer is. Back in the day, when pirates were the great outlaws, a country could attack another country and risk war, or they could covertly pay pirates to do it, which would make them privateers. For example, if the British wanted to attack a Spanish ship coming out of the Caribbean, they couldn't do it with an English ship with an English flag, because that could start a war. And at that time, Spain was really strong. So what they could do is pay off a pirate to do it. The pirate, who has a relationship to the royals, would be sharing their loot and paid by the state secretly. They would never attack British ships, they would only attack foreign ships, French, Spanish, whatever. And if a pirate attacks the ship and gets caught, they hang. No war. He did it as an individual. This is a way the British could routinely attack Spanish ships covertly through privateers. All the Spanish could do was to continue to routinely capture individual pirates, try them, and hang them. And the British, of course, would act like they were trying to fight pirates too. The whole time, however, they had their own payroll with their own pirates who attacked who they asked them to attack. This system of privateering is exactly how our modern terrorist cells work. The United States and other nations payroll their own terrorist groups, such as Al-Qaeda. They'll attack the Russians in Afghanistan, they'll attack the Russians in Chechnya, they'll fight for us in Bosnia and Kosovo and wherever we tell them to, including the United States itself in a false flag operation. If a terrorist is caught or killed, so what? They're just a terrorist. But the fact that the CIA puts them on the payroll means they're our terrorists. They are modern privateers. Phase 1, secure Afghanistan, control the opium trade, which the Taliban had cut off. It's the Opium Wars too, just as the British had done before. The US can create mass mercenary armies and foster and utilize terrorist groups at will. There's a reason Al-Qaeda has never attacked Israel. A war on terror is endless profiteering. The objective has never been about winning, much less women's liberation or fighting for freedom. The whole point is to prolong conflict for as long as possible. This is why the US preaches a war on terrorism while simultaneously engaging in acts of terrorism itself. The US began its Al-Qaeda Frankenstein back in the 80s by backing the Mujahideen and their mercenary special forces Al-Qaeda, and then the Taliban and their civil war, and then the US changed sides on paper to the Northern Alliance, but in reality it's just the CIA's occupation of the country for its own interests. The American government had a hand-in-glove relationship with Osama bin Laden while they were fighting the Soviets together. This privateer had a religious following and a lot of financial overlap with Saudi Arabia, who finances all of the extreme Wahhabi Sunni terrorist factions. Al-Zawahiri was much more of an influential privateer than bin Laden, but you never use your real puppet's face for the brand sold to the public. As Oliver North infamously stated, you must create plausible deniability. Plausible deniability. What he said here is so huge. Though the Iran-Contra operation in particular ended, that style of operation has been ongoing. Gladio 2.0 has been much in the same vein. There are a multitude of ways to launder money through Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc., through bogus NGOs, CIA-assisted narcotics trafficking, and fake foundations to create plausible deniability. Well, you have to ask yourself, just how separate is Al-Qaeda and the CIA? Why are so many terrorists who attack U.S. targets ex-CIA? Furthermore, why are so many CIA agents blocking investigation into some of these same terrorists?
So during the war, the US, UK, and Pakistan all supported groups of Arab fighters known as the Mujahideen. Two of the freedom fighters were Ramzi Youssef and Osama bin Laden.
Operation Storm 333 has just begun. That is the codename given by the Soviets for the invasion of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is bogged down by war. The Soviets have complete mastery in the skies, but on land, the Mujahideen managed to control a great part of the country. Ronald Reagan's America then decides to intensify its support of Afghan resistance. A war of symbols emerges. International Soviet friendship versus the free world, lined up behind the Star-Spangled Banner.
Just as the Columbia, we think, represents man's finest aspirations in the field of science and technology, so too does the struggle of the Afghan people represent man's highest aspirations for freedom. I am dedicating on behalf of the American people the March 22nd launch of the Columbia to the people of Afghanistan.
Reagan had defined the Soviet Union as an evil empire. I mean, this is in terms of, good and evil. So now we're on religious grounds here. And I think there was a crusade against godless communism. And I think that the Christian right enthusiastically supported his policies aimed at stopping communism. Here's what's really interesting. As part of this crusade against godless communism, who did we support in the 80s in Afghanistan? The Islamic fundamentalists. See, in those days, jihadist was not a bad word. Nowadays, jihadist in American lexicon, and I think European as well, has become synonymous with terrorist. But under the Reagan era, when the United States was supporting the Afghan freedom fighters, jihadist and freedom fighter was synonymous. And that's the way Reagan, the great communicator, he was always referring to the mujahideen that we were supporting as freedom fighters. Reagan openly supported jihadists, including some that are now fighting us.
At the very same time, another group began to arrive in Afghanistan to fight alongside the mujahideen. They were Arabs from across the Middle East who had been told by their religious leaders that their duty was to go and free Muslim lands from the Soviet invader.
I saw the fatwa, the order, saying that every Muslim has a duty to help the Afghans to liberate their land. But I had no idea where is this Afghanistan, how can I go there. I've never heard about Afghanistan. I've never heard in the map which airline goes there. From where can I take the visa? 100 questions. But I did meet Abdullah Azzam.
Abdullah Azzam was a charismatic religious leader who had begun to organize the Arab volunteers in Afghanistan. He had set up what he called the Services Bureau in Peshawar on the Afghan border. It became the headquarters of an international brigade of Arab fighters.
Azzam is a Palestinian whose hometown was occupied by Israel after the Arabs' crushing defeat in the Six-Day War. More than anyone, it is Azzam who has inspired Muslims, including bin Laden, to head to Afghanistan. The men give their organization an unassuming name, the Office of Services.
Azzam quickly became one of the most powerful figures in the battle against the Soviets. He was allowed to visit America on many occasions, both to raise funds and recruit volunteers for the jihad. But like the neoconservatives, Azzam also saw the struggle against the Soviets as just the first step in a much wider revolution. He was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who wanted Islam to play a political role in governing Muslim societies. And Abdullah Azzam believed that the Arabs in Afghanistan could be the nucleus of a new political force. They would return to their own countries and persuade the people to reject the corrupt, autocratic regimes that dominated the Middle East. One of Azzam's closest aides was a Saudi, Osama bin Laden.
Osama came to participate in '85. When he came, he came from a rich family from Saudi, and he had much money to spend. Sheikh Abdullah Azzam was a scholar. He can organize the Afghans, but he is not a rich man. So when Osama came, he filled in this gap. So the main duty of Osama in that time was spending money.
One of the most powerful of these newcomers was Ayman Zawahiri. He was the leader of a radical faction from Egypt called Islamic Jihad, and he was convinced that they, not the moderates, were the true Islamists.
We are here. We are here. The real Islamic Front. We are here, the real Islamic Front and the real Islamic opposition against Zionism. We are here, the real Islamic Front against Zionism, communism and imperialism.
Zawahiri and his small group settled in Peshawar. They began to spread this new idea among the foreign fighters, radicalizing the Islamist movement. It was not only a direct challenge to the moderate ideas of Abdullah Azzam, but it also involved a militant rejection of all American influence over the jihad, because America was the source of this corruption. Then, in 1987, the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev decided he was going to withdraw Russian troops from Afghanistan. Gorbachev asked the Americans to help him negotiate a peace that would create a stable government in Afghanistan. But the hardliners in Washington refused point blank. They would continue to help the Mujahideen until the last Russians left, without any negotiation. The future of Afghanistan would then be decided, they said, by the freedom fighters.
I think that basically we've asked the United States, help us get out if you're really interested in stopping the bloodshed.
But can you get out and leave a government in Afghanistan that supports, that is a friend of the Soviet Union?
I believe that we can get out, provided that indeed no more aid is given to what people here call freedom fighters and what we call counter-revolutionaries. I believe that's possible, provided that the United States is also interested in the same.
Well, it's not very complicated. They arrived in a matter of days on Christmas Eve in 1979. They could be home by Christmas Eve if they decided to leave Afghanistan and let the Afghans decide their own future. If you leave, the problem of support to the Mujahideen solves itself.
But there was a deep rift within the Islamist fighters based in Peshawar, between the moderates, led by Abdullah Azzam, who believed this revolution could be accomplished politically, and the extremists, like Ayman Zawahiri, who saw violent revolution as the only way. And Zawahiri now set out to extend his influence over the movement and to undermine Abdullah Azzam. To do this, he seduced Osama bin Laden and his money away from Azzam. He promised bin Laden that he could become the emir, the leader of Zawahiri's small extremist group, Islamic Jihad.
November 1989. Bin Laden's partner, Abdullah Azzam, is driving to a mosque in Peshawar, Pakistan with two of his sons. A car bomb explodes, killing them instantly. The murder, never solved, has the hallmarks of a mob rub-out. With Azzam out of the way, bin Laden quickly reorganizes the jihad network.
For Ayman Zawahiri, groups of radical Islamists who had developed his theories in even more extreme forms now set out to create violent revolutions in Algeria and Egypt.
Jalalabad, Afghanistan, summer 1996. Bin Laden has returned to the country that launched his career as a holy warrior. Bin Laden calls for a new holy war to evict U.S. troops from Saudi Arabia. He intends to launch this jihad from his base in Afghanistan.
It sent shockwaves through us. It was pretty clear from the first that bin Laden meant what he said, but it didn't catch much attention.
September 1996, a radical Islamic sect called the Taliban seizes control of the Afghan government and its capital city, Kabul. In exchange for millions of dollars in al-Qaeda funding, the Taliban agreed to provide a haven for bin Laden and his organization. In the spring of 1998, the CIA plan to snatch bin Laden moves forward with the tacit approval of the White House. They want to capture but not kill bin Laden. The goal is to bring him to trial for a series of crimes. It's a list that includes the training of militiamen who shot down 2 American helicopters and killed 18 Army Rangers in Somalia. The 1993 attack became known as Black Hawk Down. May 20th, the CIA runs a full rehearsal with its local allies, Afghan militiamen opposed to bin Laden and the Taliban. The plan is for the militiamen to capture bin Laden and take him to a desert landing zone. From there, the al-Qaeda leader would be flown out of the country. That very same week, inside a tent in a remote compound in southern Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden tapes an interview with ABC News correspondent John Miller. Bin Laden's message is crystal clear. He demands that U.S. troops leave Saudi Arabia, where they have been stationed since the 1991 Gulf War. If not, he threatens more attacks like the 1993 truck bombing of the World Trade Center.
We anticipate a black future for America. If the present injustice continues, it will inevitably move the battle to American soil, just as Ramzi Youssef and others have done.
Bin Laden said many things that at the time, I have to say, sounded a little hyperbolic and unlikely. He declared war on the United States. Yeah, you and what army?
Nairobi, Kenya, August 7th, 1998. A bomb-laden truck explodes outside the American embassy, tearing the facade off the building. 5 minutes later, a second blast nearly levels the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The twin attacks kill more than 200 people, including 12 Americans. Many of the victims are Muslims. 2 weeks later, President Clinton orders retaliation. The U.S. unleashes scores of Tomahawk cruise missiles against targets in Sudan and Afghanistan, including a pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum, Sudan, that was allegedly producing chemicals used to make nerve gas. Some Americans, however, view the military strikes as a way for the president to divert attention from another crisis, a sex scandal involving Clinton and a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky.
The bombings had a dramatic effect on the West. For the first time, the name Bin Laden entered the public consciousness as a terrorist mastermind. The suicide bombers had been recruited by Bin Laden from the Islamist training camps in Afghanistan, but his and Zawahiri's operation was very much on the fringes of the Islamist movement. The overwhelming majority of the fighters in these camps had nothing at all to do with Bin Laden or international terrorism. They were training to fight the regimes in their own countries, such as Uzbekistan, Kashmir, and Chechnya. Their aim was to establish Islamist societies in the Muslim world, and they had no interest in attacking America. Bin Laden helped fund some of the camps, and in return was allowed to look for volunteers for his operation. But a number of senior Islamists were against his new strategy, including members of Zawahiri's own group, Islamic Jihad. Even Bin Laden's displays of strength for the Western media were faked. The fighters in this video had been hired for the day and told to bring their own weapons. For beyond his own small group, Bin Laden had no formal organization, until the Americans invented one for him. In January 2001, a trial began in a Manhattan courtroom of 4 men accused of the embassy bombings in East Africa. But the Americans had also decided to prosecute Bin Laden in his absence. But to do this under American law, the prosecutors needed evidence of a criminal organization, because as with the mafia, that would allow them to prosecute the head of the organization, even if he could not be linked directly to the crime. And the evidence for that organization was provided for them by an ex-associate of Bin Laden's called Jamal al-Fadl. In reality, Jamal al-Fadl was on the run from Bin Laden, having stolen money from him. In return for his evidence, the Americans gave him witness protection in America and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Many lawyers at the trial believed that al-Fadl exaggerated and lied to give the Americans the picture of a terrorist organization that they needed to prosecute Bin Laden.
And there were selective portions of al-Fadl's testimony that I believe was false to help support the picture that he helped the Americans join together. I think he lied in a number of specific testimony about a unified image of what this organization was.
The idea, which is critical to the FBI's prosecution, that Bin Laden ran a coherent organization with operatives and cells all around the world, of which you could be a member, is a myth. There is no Al-Qaeda organization. There is no international network with a leader with cadres who will unquestioningly obey orders, with tentacles that stretch out to sleeper cells in America, in Africa, in Europe. That idea of a coherent, structured terrorist network with an organised capability simply does not exist.
The picture al-Fadl drew for the Americans of Bin Laden was of an all-powerful figure at the head of a large terrorist network that had an organized hierarchy of control. He also said that bin Laden had given this network a name, Al-Qaeda. It was a dramatic and powerful picture of bin Laden, but it bore little relationship to the truth. The reality was that bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri had become the focus of a loose association of disillusioned Islamist militants who were attracted by the new strategy. But there was no organization. These were militants who mostly planned their own operations and looked to bin Laden for funding and assistance. He was not their commander. There is also no evidence that bin Laden used the term Al-Qaeda to refer to the name of a group until after September the 11th, when he realized that this was the term the Americans had given him. The story begins in the summer of 1949, when a middle-aged school inspector from Egypt arrived at the small town of Greeley in Colorado. His name was Said Qutb. Qutb had been sent to the US to study its educational system, and he enrolled in the local state college. His photographs appear in the college yearbook. As he had travelled across the country, Qutb had become increasingly disenchanted with America. The very things that on the surface made the country look prosperous and happy, Qutb saw as signs of an inner corruption and decay. In 1950, Said Qutb travelled back to Egypt from America. On his return, Qutb became politically active in Egypt. He joined a group called the Muslim Brotherhood, who wanted Islam to play a major role in the governing of Egyptian society. And in 1952, the Brotherhood supported the revolution led by General Nasser that overthrew the last remnants of British rule. But Nasser very quickly made it clear that the new Egypt was going to be a secular society that emulated Western models. He quickly forged an alliance with America, and the CIA came to Egypt to organize security agencies for the new regime. Faced with this, the Muslim Brotherhood began to organize against Nasser, and in 1954, Qutb and other leading members of the Brotherhood were arrested by the security services. In a series of books he wrote secretly in prison, which were then smuggled out, Qutb called upon a revolutionary vanguard to rise up and overthrow the leaders. Faced with this, Nasser decided to crush Qutb and his ideas. And in 1966, Qutb was put on trial for treason. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. And on August the 29th, 1966, Qutb was executed, but his ideas lived on. The day after his execution, a young schoolboy set up a secret group. He hoped that it would one day become the vanguard that Qutb had called for. His name was Ayman Zawahiri. Zawahiri was to become the mentor to Osama bin Laden. By the late 70s, Egypt had been transformed. On the surface, it had become a modern, westernized state with a prosperous middle class, who were benefiting from a flood of Western capital that was being invested in the country. One member of this prosperous Egyptian elite was Ayman Zawahiri, who was now a young doctor, just starting his career. The group that he had started as a schoolboy, which he had modelled on the ideas of Said Qutb, had grown. Said Qutb's ideas were now spreading rapidly in Egypt, above all among students. The government of President Sadat was controlled by a small group of millionaires who were backed by Western banks. The banks had been let in by what Sadat called his open-door policy. To the Western media, Sadat denied any corruption. All Egyptians knew that this was a blatant lie.
Who has benefited now from the open-door policy? Taxi drivers, the laborers, all those has benefited from the open-door policy. It is not like they say that there are millionaires here and so. No, not at all. This is pure black propaganda from the side of the Soviet Union and his agents here in the country.
Zawahiri was convinced that the time was now approaching to fulfill Qutb's vision. The vanguard should rise up and overthrow this corrupt regime. And the man who would give the Islamists that opportunity would be Henry Kissinger. As part of his attempt to create a stable and balanced world, Kissinger had persuaded President Sadat to begin peace negotiations with the Israelis. To Kissinger, the ruthless pragmatist, religious divisions and hatreds were irrelevant. And in 1977, Sadat had flown to Jerusalem to start the peace process. To the West, it was a heroic act. But to the Islamists, it was a complete betrayal. And then, in 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini showed Zawahiri that his dream of creating an Islamist state was possible. Khomeini had inspired an uprising against the Shah of Iran. The Shah was another leader who had allowed Western banks to corrupt his country. And Khomeini had put forward the idea of an Islamist state, which was remarkably similar to Qutb's idea.
Sound very dissatisfied with what's happening in Iran now.
Not more than dissatisfied. This is disgraceful, really. I was a Secretary General of the Muslim Congress at one time. This, putting the name Islamic Revolution is a crime against Islam in the first hand.
President Sadat, do you expect that the Shah will accept the invitation? It seems like a good solution right now.
Quote me. My aeroplane is ready to bring him here. Any moment.
At the end of 1980, Ayman Zawahiri and a number of other followers of Qutb who had formed cells came together. They created an organization they called Islamic Jihad. Its leader was a man called Abdel Salam Faraj. And Faraj argued that they should kill Sadat in a spectacular way that would shock the masses. Those who carried out the assassination were a group of army officers who were a part of Islamic Jihad. They were immediately arrested, and the regime launched a massive manhunt for those behind the plot.
Sadat's murderer is arrested on sight. He is a lieutenant in the Egyptian army. Yet the incident results in over 300 Islamists being put in jail. Behind bars are the future leaders of Islamist organizations, still active around the world today. The massive presence of the International Press Corps will give them an exceptional platform to speak from, starting with their self-proclaimed spokesman, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
This is our word by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now we want to speak to the whole world. Who are we? Who are we? Why did they bring us here? And what we want to say? About the first question, we are Muslims. We are Muslims who believed in their religion, in its broad meaning, as both an ideology and practice. We believed in our religion, both as an ideology and practice, and hence we tried our best to establish this Islamic state and Islamic society. La ilaha illallah!
A few years back, during the Sadat assassination trial, Zawahiri speaks to the International Press Corps. A few yards away stands another key figure of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group, Sheikh Abdel Rahman, aka the Blind Sheikh.
Sheikh Abdul Rahman is a rather intriguing individual. He became blind as a child because of juvenile diabetes, and yet had great charismatic power, not despite this, but in part because of this. He was tortured for an extensive period of time, about 3 years, to reveal his role in setting the emotional climate that led to the assassination of Sadat. He ultimately was not convicted of this, in part because of his blindness. How can one convict a man just because of words?
With that on radical Islam and its association to terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden, I think before finishing the final conclusions to 9/11, that it's important we take an extensive look back at the official story to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and how it all ties together. In telling the story with the climate before and after the bombing, as well as the investigation, remaining segments may at times use scenes from the 1997 HBO movie Path to Paradise to reenact some of the prominent figures involved and be narrated by some of them themselves.
To try and understand why these blunders and failures occurred and why no investigation was made, we need to go to Brooklyn, only 3 miles away from the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan. This is where one finds the little Al Farouk Mosque. At the time, it was home to the Al-Kifar Refugee Center, which is no other than the American outpost for the Afghan Services Bureau in Peshawar, led by Abdullah Azzam. Azzam has just been assassinated in Peshawar. Soon afterwards, Mustafa Shalabi, in charge of the Brooklyn branch, is also killed. Both men had many enemies in common, starting with Abdel Rahman. Known as the Blind Sheikh and very active in hiring fighters for Afghanistan, he is one of the leaders of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group along with al-Zawahiri. Shalabi's assassination in Brooklyn came after a fight with the Blind Sheikh. Among the mosque's regulars are a number of individuals who train together, handling weapons and perfecting combat skills. Officially, they have every intention of joining the jihad in Afghanistan. Their activities do not seem to worry local authorities.
New York, November 5th, 1990. This 34-year-old Egyptian named El Said Nosair dons the yarmulke of an observant Jew and pockets a .357 Magnum revolver. Nosair enters a ballroom at this Midtown Manhattan hotel. Rabbi Meir Kahane, head of the tiny but violent Jewish Defense League, is finishing a speech to his followers. As Kahane steps down from the podium, Nosair pulls out the gun, fires twice, and a fatal shot enters the rabbi's throat. Nosair flees the hotel, but an armed postal officer shoots him, and police arrest him.
For the public, and largely for law enforcement, the killing of Kahane was portrayed as one crazy Arab killing one crazy Jew.
FBI and police searched Nosair's home here in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. They find more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition, bomb-making formulas, U.S. military training manuals, and a hit list of other prominent Jews. They haul 47 boxes of this material to this police precinct. But the authorities, the DA, the NYPD, the FBI, overlook most of it. November 1991. Members of the Al Farouk Mosque are raising funds for the defense of El Said Nosair. Nosair is about to go on trial for the murder of Rabbi Meir Kahane. Outspoken civil rights attorney William Kunstler is hired to defend Nosair. Eyewitnesses testify they saw Nosair crouched by Kahane holding a gun. But Kunstler convinces the jury that no scientific evidence links Nosair to the shooting.
El Said Nosair was the young Palestinian so outraged by the poison that Kahane spread and was spreading throughout America and throughout Israel.
13 years ago, he moved to Israel, where he now crusades to throw all Arabs out of that country.
The Arab is a cancer in our midst. And you don't coexist with a cancer.
That he engaged in an act of political assassination, sort of Palestinian rage. I think that was the narrative that Bill had. But then Nosair insisted he didn't do it. That in fact he wasn't the gunman. He didn't pull the trigger.
They went in with that defense and it carried because nobody could say they saw him. And all the excitement, they saw as usual nothing. And they proved nothing. And that happened. It caused riots all over the world.
You know, the guy had powder burn supposedly on his hand, and Bill got that guy acquitted. So he was obviously an incredible lawyer, but people were pretty mad at that, you know, very angry about what happened with Nosair.
Roger Stavis. He was appointed defense lawyer for El Nosair, Rabbi Kahane's killer. Stavis's line of defense is simple. His client is part of an organization that is supported by the U.S. Secret Service. His search begins, digging up confidential documents. His investigation sheds new light on America's political agenda in Afghanistan.
As soon as I began work on the case and looked at the documents that were taken from Mr. Nosair's home, I noticed all things about Afghanistan, for Afghanistan. I noticed documents from Fort Bragg, JFK Special Warfare Center. I noted manuals about training, firing, manuals about identifying Soviet aircraft and armors and armored vehicles, all of these things. And if I could show that the people were focused on Afghanistan and aiding the Mujahideen rebels, which was part of United States foreign policy in the 1980s, I could demonstrate that they were not waging a war of urban terrorism against the United States, but that they were, as I stated in my summation at the trial, they were on Team America.
The Egyptian is found guilty only of a minor weapons charge.
The FBI starts to get closely interested in the blind sheikh, as a number of tapes containing his sermons are discovered in the home of El Sayed Nosir, Rabbi Kaheni's killer.
It was extremely difficult to get very close information. We developed a lot of information from the people on the outside looking in, but we were having a lot of trouble developing first-hand information from his inner circle.
The FBI decides to increase its surveillance of the sheikh, even managing to infiltrate his immediate circle, thanks to Ahmad Salem, the terrorist bomb maker who in reality is an undercover FBI agent, who manages to infiltrate the group and blend with the sheikh's faithful. Fearing retaliation, the man, whose name at the time was Ahmad Salem, has since changed identities and now lives in hiding.
John Antisev, Agent John, one day came to me with Agent Nancy Floyd, and they said, "We have a picture, we want to show it to you. Do you know this man?" I said, "Of course, this is Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman." "Who is Sheikh Omar?" I said, "He is the one who ordered the assassination of my president." "Oh, well, guess what? He is in America." I said, "It's a surprise for me because I know that since he escaped from Egypt, he is being listed on the terrorist lists and he should not be in any country." They said, "Well, somehow he managed to come to America and he lives in New Jersey."
To this day, I don't know why the blind sheikh was issued a U.S. visa to come to the United States. It's never been adequately explained. I don't think even the 9/11 Commission was able to get to the bottom of it.
Ahmad Salem gradually becomes part of the blind sheikh's inner circle. Ahmad continues to spend time with Islamist groups tied to the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn and to El Nusayr. Now totally infiltrated into the group, he cannot turn back.
I was in Brooklyn with Ibrahim al-Gabroni. Ibrahim al-Gabroni is Sayyid Nusir's cousin. He said that we should start to do something, brother, so the government have some pressure and they don't put brother Sayyid in more troubles. So I said, "Sure, of course we should do something." He said, "Okay, do you know how to build a bomb?" I said, "Of course, that's what we do." He said, "Okay, I want you to build some bombs and I'll tell you later, what do you need?" So I said to Ibrahim al-Gabroni, "I need explosives, I need detonators, I need people to help me build the bombs, I need a safe place to build the bomb in." He said, "Okay, let me make some phone calls to Afghanistan."
As an intelligence asset, what we say in our business, he was made promises that he did not have to testify in any type of criminal proceedings. And that's the way when we took him, we did not dispute that, knowing that at the time this would never go, there wouldn't be an issue anytime soon. So when he started getting involved with talks of assassinations and pipe bombs, of course we had to change gears and we had to go from an intelligence gathering operation to a criminal investigation and gathering evidence, trying to arrest these people. At this moment in time, the number one witness against everybody is Ahmad Salem himself, and he did not want to testify. And we were trying to convince Ahmad to wear a wire. So when he met with these people and talked about assassinations and killings and pipe bombs, that he would record the conversations of the people. And he refused. Like I said, very stubborn, proud man. He wasn't going to be forced to do anything. And our superiors wanted him to wear a wire. And unfortunately, they got into an issue of who was going to be the stronger will. So they put it to him, if you don't wear a wire, if you don't, testify in court, we're not going to continue to pay you.
It was a silly personal confrontation, and actually he said, and I quote him, "You son of a bitch, coming from the Middle East, dragging sand in your shoes all the way up to here to tell me how to run my FBI and how to do my job?" I told him, "Sir, I am doing your job. None of your agents could have went undercover that deep. I'm doing it. You're not." And that even provoked him more, and he said, "Get out of here." I walked out of his office. I looked at Nancy and John. I said, "Guys, when this bomb been built by somebody and goes off by somebody else, don't come knock on my door." And that was it, and I walked away.
The blind sheikh and his contacts in Afghanistan are quick to find a replacement for Ahmad Salem. He arrives a few days later at JFK Airport in New York on a flight coming from Pakistan.
And who comes to the United States in September of '92 is Ramzi Youssef. And he immediately hooks up with those same guys, and he becomes the master bomb maker in place of our informant, Ahmad Salem.
A Pakistani Airlines flight from Karachi lands here at Kennedy Airport. Seated in the first-class cabin, Ramzi Youssef. He's traveling with a Palestinian terrorist named Ahmad Ajaj. The two men exit the plane and approach parallel stalls at an immigration post. The 6-foot-tall Youssef, dressed in a 3-piece silk Afghan suit, presents a perfectly forged Iraqi passport. He demands political asylum. When immigration officials question Ajaj, they discover that he's carrying several crudely fake passports and a suitcase stuffed with bomb-making manuals. Immigration agents take Ajaj into custody. They assign him a bed at this INS detention facility, but Youssef is allowed into the U.S. and told to appear at an immigration hearing. Throughout the fall and winter, Youssef and 3 other members of the Al Farouk Mosque are hard at work inside this storage facility in Jersey City, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. Under Youssef's direction, they assemble the device they hope will topple the Twin Towers and kill thousands of people. February 26, 1993.
11:15 a.m. Iyad Ismail and Ramzi Youssef are driving a 10-foot yellow Ryder van. Following them is a car driven by Mohammed Salameh. Salameh had leased the van from a Ryder rental agency in Jersey City 3 days earlier. It now carries a 1,500-pound bomb made of urea nitrate and hydrogen. 11:55 a.m. The yellow Ryder van pulls into level B2 of the World Trade Center garage. Iyad Ismail steers it to an illegal parking space. Ramzi Youssef lights a fuse on the bomb. The fuse is encased in rubber, which suppresses smoke and allows for a 10 to 20-minute burn time. Youssef and Ismail jump into Salameh's car and speed out of the garage. 12:10 p.m. The fuse on the bomb has been burning for 6 minutes. It's 12:17 p.m.
I'd gotten into the elevator and pressed 65.
I'm approached by an individual who asks for directions to the Newark train.
We're waiting now for the elevator to come for us.
I was standing within the door frame and had just opened the door to my office.
We entered an elevator on the 72nd floor.
I was cutting insulation, putting it on the cart.
I was in my office, and my friend was coming up, and we were going to have pizza.
I got out of the car, opened the back seat door, reached for my things, had my car keys in my hand.
The rental van detonates with a force equivalent to 800 pounds of TNT, tearing through 11-inch concrete floors in the bowels of America's famous landmark.
A possible bomb explodes under the towering World Trade Center in New York. 5 people are killed, 500 injured.
Thousands poured out of the building, gasping for air. Eyes glazed with shock, they spoke of the devastation within.
There was no help whatsoever. Trapped on 94 floors all the way up. Nobody came.
There was smoke, and then the lights went out, and I'd say about
70 floors, we had no lights.
Stairwells became smokestacks. Clouds of soot billowed up the stairs to the very top of the 110-story office towers. Some evacuees say they couldn't see their hands outstretched in front of them as they groped their way down to the ground, choking on the smoke.
The walls just blew in, and everything went blank after that. Walls collapsed, furniture's down. It's a mess downstairs.
The explosion blasted a gaping hole through the ceiling of the second sub-basement in Tower Number 1. This is where firefighters say the injuries were most severe. A crowded stop for commuter trains that shuttle workers across the Hudson to New Jersey. The offices just above the area lie in ruin.
I was physically lifted up into the air and thrown back with terrific force.
All of a sudden, just boom, something hit me, and it's like, it took my breath away. It blew me across the room.
The exterior walls of the garage came caving into the path concourse level.
There was mass confusion. People were running out of the building. Ambulances were pulling up. Fire trucks were pulling up.
Police set up a command center on the street outside Tower 1.
Smoke was emitting from every single floor.
The bomb was a urea nitrate device enhanced with hydrogen gas. The bomb ripped a 30-meter wide hole through 4 sublevels of concrete. 6 people were killed and 1,042 injured as smoke poured into the towers.
So now, amidst the rubble, law enforcement agencies are in a new race against time to find the people who did this. As the day wears on, no confirmation is given to reporters about the cause of the blast, but officials do not hide their strong suspicions.
We'll give you a certain conclusion when we can prove it. Looks like a bomb, it smells like a bomb, it's probably a bomb.
A group of investigators is assigned to work inside the crater created by the bomb. NYPD Detective Donald Sadawi and ATF Agent Joe Hanlon are assigned to the same team.
It was a survey mission. We also had the mission to attempt to take swabbings that could be taken back to the laboratory later that day and examined to possibly get a lead on the type of explosive that was used.
Investigators found the axle of the Ryder truck that was used in the bombing and were able to trace the vehicle identification number to the man who rented the truck.
The FBI then traces the van's registration to a Ryder rental agency in New Jersey. The van was the same vehicle rented and reported stolen by Mohammed Salome.
My beeper went off, and it was Detective Napoli calling me, and he said, I called the number, and he said, "You're not going to believe it, but they found the remnants of the van that was used to carry the explosives, and it was rented in Jersey City, and it was a Ryder company, and the person who rented it was Mohammed Salome." And I tell you, I was like, oh my God, Mohammed Salome. We had photographs of Mohammed. We have photographs of Mohammed training at the range. He's a friend of Nosir. He's a friend of all the guys that we've been looking at for the last few years. And I said, these are the guys we were looking at.
Salome arrives at the rental office in New Jersey to pick up his $400 deposit on the van. When he arrives, an agent greets Salome from behind the desk. But he is not a Ryder agent. He's an undercover agent with the FBI.
After some discussion, Salome walked out. As he stepped out of the office, dozens of FBI agents who had been monitoring their discussion descended upon Salome. Less than 1 week after the bombing, the FBI had a suspect in custody. Salome said little to the agents who questioned him about the bombing. They knew it was probable that he had not acted alone. When Salome was arrested, agents recovered various personal items, including his wallet, which contained several business cards and telephone numbers. They began by searching the address listed on his driver's license. A former roommate told agents that Salome no longer lived at that address. However, they were able to find some belongings of Salome's that he had left behind. There were news clippings and photos relating to Nosir, and a photo of him and Nosir together. There were numerous bank records. There were also more names and numbers for investigators to pursue. Analysis of all the confiscated phone records led investigators to an apartment in Jersey City. The landlord who owned the apartment at 40 Pamrapo Avenue confirmed that Salome and another individual rented the apartment from early January of 1993 until the end of February. A landlord could not confirm the identity of Salome's roommate. After executing the warrant, agents discovered that 40 Pemrapo Avenue was the bomb factory, the place where the conspirators mixed an explosive powerful enough to rock the World Trade Center. Inside the apartment and an adjacent garage, FBI forensic examiners recovered traces of a diverse range of chemicals. While agents searched the apartment, the identity of Salome's mysterious roommate emerged. They found papers requesting political asylum in the name of Ramzi Youssef, who, according to the documents, had been detained in September of 1992 at Kennedy Airport for entering the country without a visa. At every step of the investigation, Ramzi Youssef's name appeared. He was a known international terrorist and an expert with explosives. Agents now believed he was the mastermind behind the World Trade Center bombing. They soon learned that he fled the country the night of the Trade Center bombing. An international manhunt for Ramzi Youssef had begun. With 4 conspirators now in custody, authorities decided to bring them to trial while the search for other bombers continued. In February of 1994, a year after the bombing, the trial concluded. The jury forewoman read off 38 pronouncements of guilty: conspiracy, explosive destruction of property, interstate transportation of explosives, and murder. Mohammed Salome, the chemist Nidal Ayad, Ahmed Ajaj, and Mahmoud Abu Halima, known as the Red, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. The mastermind, Ramzi Youssef, and his accomplice Iyad Ishmael were still fugitives.
In the days that followed this first attack on the World Trade Center in New York, the FBI tries to convince Ahmad Salem to resume his undercover mission amongst the followers of Sheikh Abdel Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh. With the promise of $1 million, Ahmad accepts and rapidly manages to become his personal assistant.
I used to go to his house at 7 o'clock in the morning, cook for him, serve him, and whoever come, lunch, and do the dishes, and take him to the bathroom. He is blind, so he cannot walk on his own, so I put the slipper to his feet and so on. One of Sheikh Omar's followers, his name is Siddiq Ali, start to discuss with me blowing up something here. And I said, that's a very good idea, and I think we should do that. And then he started with different targets, the World Trade Center again, to tell the American that we can get you anytime. And then he said there is a military armory in 96th Street. And then he started to go into different targets.
So Ahmad reported that to me within days. And then we were off to the next set of plots. We had a warehouse, that we were using as an undercover warehouse for another case. And we took that warehouse and we gave it to Ahmad to present to Siddiq Ali as a place where would be their headquarters to continue with the operation.
We had cameras in there, had El Salam wired when he was in conversation, lots of surveillance, lots of videotaping of the plotters, and watched it very, very carefully.
We spend hours and hours in the warehouse mixing chemicals and the fumes, and it's just so awful. And with the heat, if God forbid any spark or anything goes wrong, you got the entire 2-3 blocks of the city will go away. We had 5 bombs at that time. Each one is 1,500 pounds bomb, which is like similar to the Oklahoma bomb in the magnitude of it. One for Holland Tunnel, one for Lincoln Tunnel, one for Washington Bridge, one for the United Nations, and one for the FBI building.
Potentially it was very, very dangerous. I mean, obviously we tried to control it as best we could with the informant and the surveillances, but the plot was essentially to blow up the bridges and tunnels connecting New York and New Jersey, the UN building, the Manhattan FBI building, simultaneously, really. And thousands of people, was the plot, would die by drowning in the tunnels connecting the 2 states here in the New York area. So, it was a plot of tremendous dimension and potential extreme danger.
The FBI, in control of the overall operation, decides to close in on the head of the network, With a wire on, Imad will try to compromise Rahman.
We go to the kitchen. It's a very small space. And then I told him that Sadi and I start to build something big, very big for the United Nations. What do you think? It is permissible or it is illicit? So Sheikh Omar answered, it is not illicit, it is okay, but don't do it. I said, don't do it, why? He said, it is better, and then he put his mouth into my left ear because I'm holding him in my left arm, and he started to whisper.
This recording by Imad Salem is, for the American justice system, the proof of the Sheikh's implication in the network's terrorist acts. On the night of June 24, 1993, Mary Jo White gives the FBI orders to arrest the entire network.
On June 24, 1994, FBI agents stormed a warehouse in Queens and caught several members of a terrorist cell in the act of assembling bombs.
Sadiq and the informant discussed placing bombs in a car, driving that car into a building in the United Nations complex, and then detonating that bomb. The terrorists are accused of testing timing devices for the bomb, giving the confidential informant $300 to rent a safe house in Queens where the bombs would be made. 6 arrests were made in Jamaica, Queens this morning in a garage behind a storefront on 90th Avenue in Jamaica. Those happened before dawn today. During that time, large quantities of diesel fuel and liquid fertilizer, similar to the substance allegedly used to bomb the World Trade Center, were seized in that raid. The New York City Police Bomb Squad removed several 55-gallon drums of bomb chemicals, some of it said to be diesel fuel, some of it said to be this liquid fertilizer, and some of it already mixed. Now, Ibrahim Sadiq Ali allegedly told the informant that he had participated in test explosions preparing the bomb that was used to bomb the World Trade Center. Now, the plan, according to the federal complaint filed in court this morning, blow up the United Nations building, codenamed the Big House by the conspirators, then destroy the Lincoln and Holland tunnels with bombs, and then murder security guards outside the Federal Plaza where the FBI headquarters are located, drive a car bomb into the basement of the federal building and blow it up, and all of that in the same day. That was allegedly the plan.
Apprehended soon afterwards, the blind sheik is sentenced to life imprisonment.
Salem was paid an estimated $1.5 million to infiltrate and inform on Rahman and his followers. He was recruited shortly after the 1991 assassination of right-wing Rabbi Meir Kahane.
But during the investigation, some startling information came to light.
Last winter, the FBI was praised for its speed in cracking the case of the World Trade Center bombing and bringing 4 suspects to trial. Now, there is some evidence that the FBI may have known of the plot in advance through an informant and might even have stopped the bombing that killed 6 people. Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has the story.
FBI agents might have been able to prevent last February's deadly explosion at New York's World Trade Center. They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Imad Salem. Unbeknownst to the FBI at the time, Salem recorded many of his conversations with his handlers.
I'm holding 903 pages of draft transcripts.
William Kunstler represents Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman and several others charged with conspiring to blow up a series of New York City landmarks 4 months after the World Trade Center bombing. That case has not yet gone to trial. Kunstler confirmed newspaper reports of the Salem transcripts. In one, Salem complains to an FBI agent, "Since the bomb went off, I feel terrible. I feel bad. I feel here is people who don't listen." The agent replies, "Hey, I mean, it wasn't like you didn't try and I didn't try. You can't force people to do the right thing."
There is material in here to show gross governmental misconduct.
Today, attorneys for the defendants in the ongoing World Trade Center bombing case formally asked for the transcripts of Salem's tapes.
Quite frankly, beyond me, why now, the 4th week into the trial,
We still don't have these materials.
Prosecutors have refused to comment publicly, but legal experts say the defense may have no right to those transcripts.
It's not a defense to a crime to say, if only the government had stopped me, I wouldn't have done it. So this isn't material that ordinarily the defense would be entitled to.
Notice the media emphasizes that they might have been able to stop it. They then gloss over the fact that the bomb was built by their agent, under FBI supervision, in conjunction with the district attorney.
Youssef fled to Pakistan immediately after the bombing. Ralph Blumenthal of the New York Times reported another story on October 28, 1993.
It was supposedly supposed to be a sting operation where they had an FBI informant find a group of people that were allegedly going to do something harmful in the future to the United States, organize them, and do a sting operation on them to arrest them. However, that didn't happen. The bomb did go off in the basement of the World Trade Center, and they did arrest these individuals by FBI agents that actually did their job, the field agents, and come to find out that all of them had been on the CIA payroll in Afghanistan.
Mr. Salem secretly recorded hours of his conversations with the law enforcement officers that told him to build the bomb.
Salem, perhaps experienced in the machinations of black ops, had the sense to tape some of his telephone conversations with his FBI handlers.
A newspaper article revealed the existence of the tapes, and the Reuters news agency received written transcripts. A copy of one of the most revealing conversations between Ahmad Salem and an FBI agent named John was acquired by WBAI. In that conversation, Salem demands more money from the FBI, outlining his contributions to the agency, including a cryptic statement by Salem to the FBI. Salem says, "We know the bombs start to be built by your confidential informant."
No, even the last 3 weeks is going to be a nice payment. I'm just telling you for the future and what the expenses, they just don't want to buy in on $500 of expenses. That's all. We're just going to have to give me the, some of the expenses, and they'll pay what operationally they are allowed to pay.
Let me think about it.
Don't think it. There's nothing to think about.
Of course I have to think about it. I mean, I have...
And then later on, there's bonuses and things of that nature. The only thing I'm telling you different than from before is that it's not a salary.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I'm telling you. That is different than what we were doing anyway.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay, let him to go recruit Ahmad Abdu, or let him to go talk to Ahmad Abdul Sattar. Ahmad Sattar, he's a good subject. He can really give you a big help.
Yeah.
Let him really to give you a big help.
Look, he doesn't understand everything.
Well, he have to understand. He is the boss. We all running our heads around this boss. So he gotta understand this point.
But basically nothing has changed. I'm just telling you for my own sake.
Yeah.
That this isn't a salary. That it's, but you got paid regularly for good information. I mean, the expenses were a little bit out of the ordinary, and it was really questioned. Don't tell Nancy I told you this.
Well, I have to tell her, of course.
Well, then if you have to, you have to.
Yeah, because, I mean, the lady was being honest, and I was being honest, and everything was submitted with a receipt.
Yeah.
And now it's questionable.
It's not questionable. It's like a little out of ordinary.
Okay.
All
right. I don't think it was. If that's what you think, guys, fine. But I don't think that, because we was start already building the bomb, which went off in the World Trade Center. It was built by supervision from the Bureau and the DA, and we was all informed about it, and we know that the bomb start to be built. By who? By your confidential informant. What a wonderful, great case.
Well.
And then he put his head in the sand and said, oh, no, that's not true. He is son of a bitch. Okay, it's built with a different way in another place, and that's it.
Well, don't make any rash decisions. I'm just trying to be as honest with you as I can.
Of course, I appreciate that.
And as far as the payments go and everything like that, they're there. I guarantee you that they are there.
Hundreds of hours of taped conversations exist between Salem and his FBI handlers, but they were never used in the trials of the bombing conspirators.
According to a source close to the case, Ahmad Salem checked into a Manhattan hospital 3 hours after the blast, complaining of a severe ringing in his ears. A hospital spokesperson refuses to confirm or deny the report.
A man who risked everything to go undercover in a terror organization releasing new recordings showing how the United States may have been able to stop the World Trade Center bombing back in '93. However, Ahmad Salem says that the feds forced him to stop his work when he refused to risk wearing a wire. Just a few months later, the terror cell brought in Ramzi Youssef. He put together the plan to set off a bomb at the World Trade Center, a bomb that killed 6 people and hurt 1,000 more. After, Salem made his recording of a conversation with one of the handlers. Bear with us here. The audio's not great, so listen up.
If we was continuing with what we was doing, this bomb would never go off.
Absolutely, but don't repeat that.
Salem wanted to complain to FBI headquarters about the Bureau's failure to stop the bombing. But Agent John Aktasev persuaded him otherwise, saying, quote, "I don't think the New York people would like the things out of the New York offices to go to Washington, D.C." Agent Nancy Floyd verified Ahmad Salem's account. The Independent reported that several of the bombers were trained by the CIA to fight in the Afghan war, and that the CIA admitted partial responsibility for the bombings. Ron Kuby, defense attorney, said concerning the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, quote, "The mastermind of the 1993 WTC bombing is the government of the United States. It was a phony government-engineered conspiracy to begin with, and it would never have amounted to anything had the government not planned it."
You would think at this point that it was in part a government conspiracy, but that's not exactly the case when we really look into Mohammed Salome. Following the bombing, police searched an apartment on 34 Kingston Avenue in Jersey City, which was the initial address Salome listed on the rider rental agreement for the van. According to mainstream news sources, the apartment had been rented by a woman identified as Josie Hadass, who turned out to be a Mossad operative who fled. Washington Post Malcolm Gladwell wrote, Salome had provided a telephone number in connection with the rental agreement that was traced to a person named Josie Hadass at a Jersey City address. A search of the Hadass apartment Thursday afternoon had discovered, among other things, a letter addressed to the defendant, Salome, tools and wiring, and manuals concerning antenna, circuitry, and electromagnetic devices. The article stated, a law enforcement officer trained as a bomb technician has examined these materials, and the FBI said, and concluded, that they constitute evidence of a bomb maker at the location. Lastly, a dog trained in the detection of explosives responded positively to a closet space within the apartment. Safar Bungas, editor of Crescent International, a Canadian journal on Islamic politics, confirmed to sources that Gusi, aka Josie Hadass, was a long-established Mossad operative and that she had penetrated Islamic circles in New York, as had another intelligence operative, Ahmad Salem. So what happened to Josie Hadass? On March 8, 1993, the International Herald Tribune quoted a response by the reporter's question about the role of Hadass in the Mossad to FBI spokesman Joe Valquet, who said, even if it were true, we wouldn't tell you anyway. On August 3, 1993, Paul D'Aranzio interviewed William Kunstler on the Let Them Talk radio program, where Kunstler revealed some details of what he had heard on the Salem tapes, as well as some of his speculations. Here's a transcript part of that interview. Kunstler said, I've read lots of the tapes by now, transcriptions of the tapes, which were just furnished to me today. Before I came here, I read some of them, and they are things like having him, Salem, say, well, I think we ought to bomb the George Washington Bridge. That's a very good target. It would make the commuters race hell with this government of ours. And then Sadiq Ali says, yeah, Salem, I think so-and-so. Ali, yeah, and so on. That's the way it goes, virtually throughout these hundreds of pages of transcription. These are 150 hours of tapes, D'Aranzio responded. Kunstler adds that Salem was a recipient of between $250,000 and $1 million for his services as an informant, plus monies paid to him by other sources linked to foreign governments, including money from an organization founded by the assassinated Rabbi Meir Kahane. Kunstler responded, he, FBI informant Ahmad Salem, also received money from Kahane Chai, Rabbi Meir Kahane's group, probably from a lot of other people. Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad is not someone to exclude. Probably received money from the Egyptian government. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Egyptian army, which apparently he was.
People speculate that Meir Kahane could wind up dead.
You know that.
I know that.
And you have suggested that it would not be at the hands of an Arab, but at the hands of a Jew.
Yes.
Why would they want to murder Mayor Kahana now?
Because they are frustrated. They know of no other way to stop him.
Even prior with Nosier's trial, Kunstler maintained an assertion that Kahane was murdered by enemies within his own organization and suffered repercussions while defending him and the 1993 bombers.
I asked Dad if he thought Nosier was innocent. He told me that a lawyer never asks his client that question. This was one case he didn't even try to justify.
He sort of morphed into representing the unpopular, almost any unpopular. And it didn't matter so much as to how you became unpopular.
Why is he doing this? I mean, why is he representing those people? You know, aren't there still other cases of people we agree with out there?
He lost a lot of the liberal support that he had. And he was no longer the great civil liberties, civil rights lawyer.
After the verdict, the Jewish Defense Organization staged daily protests in front of our house, shot out our front windows with red paint pellets, and called my father a self-hating Jew.
Kunstler is a traitor! Kunstler is a traitor! Kunstler is a traitor!
But it was scary. There were police at either end of the street.
So I hope you people will think of the questions that I don't have. Rabbi Meir Kahane is perhaps the most well-known Jewish leader in the world and certainly the most controversial. His fame started in 1968 when he organized the Jewish Defense League, which became notorious for its militant activities against the Soviet Union, as well as for its self-defense patrols in the inner city, which were meant to protect poor and elderly Jews. Arrested many times for his beliefs and convictions, at one point he served 11 months in a federal prison.
Prior to finding the JDL, in the late 1950s to early 1960s, Kahana worked as an FBI informant infiltrating the John Birch Society under the name Michael King. The JDL is a racist and oftentimes violent group of Jewish supremacists that's not a part of mainstream Jewry. They're not only known for violent demonstrations, but also for committing domestic terrorism. In 1975, Kahane was arrested for leading an attack on the police outside a Soviet UN mission and injuring 2 officers. Later that year, Kahane was accused of conspiring to kidnap a Soviet diplomat, bomb the Iraqi embassy in Washington, and ship arms abroad from Israel. His probation for a 1971 firebombing incident was revoked and Kahane was found guilty of violating probation and served a 1-year federal prison sentence. A list of Kahane and JDL crimes are on the FBI site. JDL members and leaders, including Kahana's multiple acts of terrorism, are so prominent that even the ADL have them listed on their site. However, the most interesting ones I found were these. September 27, 1970, 2 members of the JDL were arrested in an alleged plot to hijack an Arab airliner. The 2 were arrested at Kennedy Airport carrying firearms and explosives. They were later indicted on 6 counts by a grand jury but pleaded guilty only to a charge of passport falsification. February 6, 1973, an FBI agent revealed that members of the JDL had planned to use a drone airplane in 1971 to bomb the Soviet mission to the UN in New York. But apparently none of these operations, even by plane, can be considered international terrorism nor remotely true, because it either requires the prize of 72 virgins or you have to be Japanese.
That night, Youssef makes his way to New York's JFK Airport. Youssef boards his flight and flies first class to Karachi, Pakistan.
But the perpetrator of the first 1993 attack on the World Trade Center is still at large. For Americans, Ramzi Youssef is now considered public enemy number 1. 1994, the Philippines. Arab fighters flock towards a country in the throes of Islamist guerrilla warfare. Amongst them are Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his nephew, Ramzi Youssef. The 2 partners in crime have many projects. Posing as businessmen, they meet in bars in Manila, mostly karaoke bars, to ensure their conversations cannot be recorded. An exotic setting. Both men develop relationships with local Manila girls who are happy to go out with rich businessmen. They will use them to carry out their plans, asking them to buy components needed to manufacture their next bombs. At first, they plan on assassinating Bill Clinton, but they finally choose to target the Pope, Scheduled to come to Manila in January of 1995, Ramsey creates a new devilish device that is untraceable.
He was here to perfect a bomb that would become an invention of the decade, or if not the century, which is a liquid bomb, okay, that cannot be detected by metal detector in the airport. And he tested this bomb in several locations. One of the tests that he conducted was to put this liquid bomb in a theater in Manila. It's called Greenbelt Theater. Okay, he ordered Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to put the liquid bomb below the seat of that movie house. So it exploded at around 10:30 in the evening.
Only one person is wounded in the theater, but the test is conclusive. The next step, the installation of an explosive device on a commercial airliner. Ramzi Youssef boards a plane in Manila headed for Japan. During the layover on the island of Cebu, he disappears, leaving the device under his seat. The bomb explodes according to plan, killing a passenger, but the pilot manages to land the plane in Japan. Just one row of seats away, the plane would have exploded mid-flight.
I flew to Manila at the time to investigate what was going on, but we had no clear notion yet of what was actually planned. And when the intelligence emerged about the plot, and the intelligence emerged actually accidentally, just as a result of a fire in the apartment where explosives were being concocted.
In this 6-story building on President Carino Boulevard, Youssef has set up a terror workshop with his old friend Abdul Murad. He has transformed the kitchen into a bomb factory. As Youssef cooks up explosives by the sink, the concoction accidentally ignites. The acrid smoke drives the two men from their apartment. It attracts the attention of the Philippine National Police. Youssef escapes to a nearby karaoke bar, but he sends Murad back to his apartment to retrieve his Toshiba laptop, which he uses to store his plans for terror attacks. Police arrest Murad as he tries to flee. They also seize the laptop. Youssef is watching from across the street. Within hours, he buys a first-class ticket to Singapore and slips out of the country.
The plot involved the destruction simultaneously over the Pacific of 11 U.S. passenger aircraft, and it very nearly succeeded.
Indeed, the plot is foiled at the last moment when a fire breaks out in the apartment where Ramzi makes his bombs, on which the police discover the details of an operation codenamed Bojinka. Abdul Hakim Murad, a commercial airline pilot, is arrested. He's interrogated by Colonel Mendoza, a veteran fighter against Islamist rebels, who threatens to deliver him to the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad.
You are telling 50% truth, 50% liar. Maybe if this lie will exceed 50%, I will not waste my time again here and deliver to you to the Israeli again. I'm becoming impatient. You are creating stories that are unbelievable. But I'm starting to believe on him. Why? Because I have seen his eyes. He's not winking. He can see me eye to eye. And that's what I'm after. I have seen these eyes long time ago, several times. So this guy is telling me the truth.
Analyzing the computer's contents, investigators then discover new elements. It's the follow-up to the Bojinka plan, whose concept is radically new.
That's the biggest surprise. When the third component of the Ublan Bojinka is the seizing commercial aircraft in the continental U.S., controlling it, and diving crash specifically to Langley, Virginia. Okay, and other targets. How did you know this? Because Ramzi Youssef is telling me. So you are admitting that you are one of the pilots. Mr. Murad, I remember that you told me that you studied pilot here. Who are your companions? There is a pilot training in the US. So I was again mesmerized. He is emphasizing, Mr. Murad is emphasizing that it is a suicide attack using an aircraft.
Do you think that some of the pilots of 9/11 were already in 95 ready to operate?
Yeah, based on my analysis, some of them might be there already. I have reasons to believe that it was the blueprint of 9/11.
Colonel Mendoza insists that he shared all this information with the FBI. The FBI acknowledges receiving intelligence from Mendoza, but claims there were no details about the plot that became 9/11.
They had up to 10 Islamic terrorists training in U.S. flight schools. That plot was well in motion, and Ramzi Youssef had it all on his Toshiba laptop. They had up to 7 targets, including the Trade Center, the Pentagon, nuclear facilities, CIA headquarters, the Sears and Transamerica Towers, and the White House.
By now, the FBI's $2 million reward for information on Youssef finally yields a tip. Islamabad, Pakistan, February 7th, 1995. A team of American and Pakistani agents race through Islamabad toward the Sukasa guest house. They arrest Youssef and take him into custody. His uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, is in another room of the same Al-Qaeda safe house. But the uncle walks away into the shadows of radical Islam's underground network. He has been identified by the FBI as a terrorist. In fact, U.S. intelligence will begin referring to him by his initials, KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who studied engineering in North Carolina and then fought alongside Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Within 36 hours of Youssef's arrest, FBI agents are transporting him by helicopter to a New York City jail to await trial. The pilot passes the Twin Towers. One of the FBI agents lifts Youssef's hood and points toward the World Trade Center. See? It's still standing, he says. Ramzi Youssef replies that if he'd had enough time and money, he would have brought the whole thing down.
Ramzi Youssef, while born in Kuwait, was born of Pakistani and Palestinian parents. So the Palestinian cause would have been something inculcated in him from early childhood on, and the enmity towards the West, but Israel in particular, was something deeply seared within him. Here was a man with very powerful educational credentials to play a very active role in designing airborne explosives and in technically planning operations. One of the interesting aspects about Ramzi Youssef is his family connection. He is the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the architect of the 9/11 attack. So we have a family tradition of radicalism here.
Actually, he's forgetting that it's 2 nephews. One of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew and cousin to Ramzi, Ammar al-Baluchi, aka Ali Abd al-Ziz, who was arrested in 2003 in Pakistan, also linked to being a bin Laden bagman who funneled over $100,000 to ringleader Mohammed Atta. According to Wikipedia and mainstream sources, it's not known whether Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was born on April 14, 1965, or March 1, 1964, or whether he was born in Baluchistan, Pakistan, or even Kuwait City, Kuwait, as BBC News has reported. He's fluent in Arabic, English, Urdu, Baluchi, and is also believed to belong to the Baluch ethnic group. Baluch are mainly northwestern Iranian. Ramzi has described himself as an Iraqi, as a Kuwaiti national, and as a Baluchi from Pakistan. What's it all mean? According to Israeli journalist Yossi Melman, who wrote in 1984 in Haaretz, and later in a book called Spies Against Armageddon Inside Israel's Secret Wars, that since the 1950s, Shin Bet, Israel's FBI, is known to have put agents in Arab sectors mixing in with Arabs and creating families. Their bosses call them Musta Aravim, which in Hebrew basically means Arab masquerader or masquerading as Arab. They are commonly known as Arab platoons. Now some of you may ask, how could Israeli Jews mix into Arab areas without other Arabs or Muslims noticing? As most Americans are unaware, other than white European Jews in Israel, Israel's population also consists of Arab Jews who are dark-skinned and without fail are treated as a minority. Unlike the European Jews who harbor Israel, Arab Jews are either generations from Palestine or both neighboring Middle Eastern and African countries prior to the 1948 formation of Israel. And because it's compulsory for Israeli citizens to serve in the military, Arab Jews do work within the Israeli intelligence. This is the advantage of how Israel has perfected toppling and infiltrating neighboring Muslim and Arab nations. Don't think so? How do you think Israel has been able to topple over Egypt so many times? Check out the Lavon Affair, aka Operation Susanna, on Wikipedia.
Spies Against Armageddon is the new book that takes a closer look inside the matter. Dan Raviv co-wrote the book. There have been recent news stories that we've talked about, those assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. Can you say with all certainty that this group is behind those assassinations?
I do feel certain. I have co-authored this book with Yossi Melman, who's one of the leading Israeli journalists. We did a book even 22 years ago, Terrell, called Every Spy a Prince. And so we've kept our contacts, and we think we understand what Israeli intelligence does and why it does it. So one move that's right out of the Mossad's playbook is to infiltrate some of its own operatives, Israelis, into Iran. They have ways of getting in, and we say that they assassinated at least 4 Iranian nuclear scientists.
And that's the question there. You wonder, how can an Israeli assassin get into the borders of Iran? How do these missions happen?
Well, no one's telling us exactly how they've been doing it in Iran, because that's very current. But we did get the history of how the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, has done it in other enemy countries, in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon. And so there's a special unit of the Mossad, almost like a Mossad within the Mossad.
A formerly secret CIA assessment, Israel Foreign Intelligence and Security Services, from March 1979 reported that it had been a long-standing policy for Israeli intelligence to disguise Jews as Arabs. One of the established goals of the intelligence and security services is that each officer be fluent in Arabic. A 9-month intensive Arabic language course is given annually to students. Other than the false identities of the 9/11 hijackers, as well as other wanted radical Islamic terrorists, or events that have been blamed by such, this revelation in mind may lead one to speculate that this Israeli advantage makes it impossible to detect who is really an authentic Muslim. World-renowned novelist and historian best known for espionage and military expertise, as well as storylines, Tom Clancy wrote in his book Op Center, Acts of War, that Must Arabim, Arab masqueraders, do not allow their real identities to become known to people outside their unit, and that even when they are undercover, they go to great lengths to avoid being recorded. A made-for-TV miniseries based on Clancy's book depicts such an example.
Including the name of Stolypin's paymaster, Abdul Fazawi. You recognize the name?
Yeah, renegade arms trader, recruited by Mossad in 83.
He's your man? We train many Arabs.
So what does this all have to do with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the first family of terrorism? A lot, considering what we have seen with Israel's role in 9/11. While the narrative mastermind is supposed to be Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, yet again, there's another Israeli link to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, but through Ramzi Youssef with his original companion and possible commandant, Ahmed Ajaj, who had both landed at JFK Airport on September 2nd, 1992. As you'll recall, Ramzi Youssef was still let in the country using an Iraqi passport, while Ajaj was detained by airport security for trying to enter on a photo-substituted Swedish passport while claiming to be a member of the Swedish press, carrying bomb-making manuals, videos, and other materials on weapons explosive assembly, anti-American and anti-Israeli materials, instructions on document forgery, and 2 devices made to alter passports issued from Saudi Arabia. One of the manuals was entitled Al-Qaeda, The Basics. However, prior to all this, Ajaj was arrested in 1988 as a petty crook for counterfeiting US dollars outside a base in East Jerusalem. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison but only served 1 year. Robert L. Freeman on The Village Voice, who had sources within Israeli intelligence, reported that while Ajaj was in prison, he was recruited by the Mossad. When he had gotten out, he seemingly undergone a radical transformation. Suddenly he became a devout Muslim and an outspoken hardline nationalist, yet prior, Ajaj was never known to be involved in Intifada activities or being pro-Hamas or PLO. Friedman also stated, Youssef associate Ajaj appeared to have been recruited as a Mossad asset and deployed as an infiltrator in Islamic fundamentalist circles, quote, Then Ajaj was arrested for smuggling weapons into the West Bank, supposedly for El Fatah, a subdivision of the PLO. Freeman sources in Israeli intelligence say that the arrest and Ajaj's subsequent deportation were staged by the Mossad to establish his credentials as an Intifada activist. The Mossad allegedly tasked Ajaj to infiltrate radical Palestinian groups operating outside Israel and to report back to Tel Aviv. Israeli intelligence sources say that it is not unusual for Mossad to recruit from the ranks of common criminals. After Ajaj's deportation from Israel, he showed up in Pakistan, where he turned up in the company of anti-Soviet Mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan. This in itself can point further toward Ajaj working for the Mossad, for according to the Covert Action Information Bulletin, September 1987, the funding and supply lines for the Mujahideen was not only the second largest covert operation, quote, in the CIA's history, but it was also, according to former Mossad operative Viktor Ostrovsky, writing in The Other Side of Deception, under the direction supervision of the Mossad. From what we've gathered from 9/11 and the 93 bombing so far, and without a clear indication of where KSM and Youssef were born and what ethnicity, by this revelation, this could also mean that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the so-called mastermind behind 9/11 that's currently in Gitmo right now, may have been an Israeli Mossad asset working ubiquitously for the loose base, aka Al-Qaeda.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM, confessed to masterminding the 9/11 attacks from A to Z in a highly dubious, heavily redacted confession extracted after 4 years of torture in a secret CIA prison, and after having his sons abducted and used as bargaining chips in the interrogation process.
Unlike the torture stories we've been told about KSM, when Ramzi Youssef was taken into custody, according to U.S. Secret Agent Brian Parr, he stated that Youssef was friendly and he actually seemed eager to talk to us. So are these individuals known as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Youssef really who they are? Are they Arabs or are they Muslims?
And let me ask you, I mean, you've been answering a lot of questions lately about the newsletters that were published under your name, and some of the things contained in them were conspiracy theories. Some of the stuff was very incendiary, and, you know, saying that in 1993 the Israelis were responsible for the bombing of the World Trade Center.
In his 2013 book, False Flags, Template for Terror, recently deceased Michael Collins Piper wrote, "If the uncle and nephew teams really are Arabs and or Muslims, the fact that nephew Youssef was working closely with a reported Israeli intelligence asset in the first World Trade Center attack is still noteworthy indeed, particularly since the Israeli asset in question was himself an Arab." I mean, was it wrong and controversial for few daring investigative researchers and writers to speculate or conclude these events being Israeli ops even prior to 2009? When the New York Times reported that Flight 93's hijacker Ziad al-Jar's cousin, Ali al-Jar, was arrested in Lebanon for having been a Mossad spy for 20 years, not to mention more than likely Egyptian Atta was an Israeli asset? Although we haven't finished covering the details in the rest of the 9/11 attacks, obvious as it should be by now, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing already connects too much to 9/11, in either case of official version or conspiracy fact. However, they tie into another event that isn't likely associated.
After 93, a series of terrorist attacks plagued the U.S. As we move through this, you will begin to understand how specific agendas within specific parts of government, media, and industry have created a propaganda campaign to wage war, with 9/11 as the prime selling point. There was the OKC bombing in 95, the embassy bombings in Africa in 1998, the USS Cole in 2000 in Yemen, and then, of course, there was 9/11.
There's an anomaly in there. All the attacks you just mentioned were blamed on Al-Qaeda, except for OKC.
However, there is a connection. Timothy McVeigh's lawyer claims that he and Terry Nichols were not the only two people who planned the OKC bombing. He contends that Nichols made several trips to the Philippines in the years before the bombings and met with Ramzi Youssef. McVeigh served in the Gulf War, and Youssef entered the country with an Iraqi passport. Coincidence?
We know that Terry Nichols and Ramzi Youssef, both people were in the same city at the same time. That's odd. Both people were interested in making bombs. Both people opposed the American government. Is it conceivable that in a mid-sized Philippine city The two people who were interested in making bombs and hated the American government could have found each other somehow? I think it's conceivable.
Basically, there are 4 elements that I have to receive information regarding.
South of this address, are you going to check on that? 179, that's affirmative.
Marks the worst U.S. terrorist attack in history, the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building in downtown Oklahoma City.
The explosion shook central Oklahoma, killed nearly 170 people and injured more than 400 others.
Someone had detonated a Ryder truck filled with explosives outside the building.
The only suspect actually charged in the bombing so far is Timothy McVeigh.
Timothy McVeigh.
Timothy McVeigh.
On the morning of April 19th, 1995, the Alfred P. Murrah building was torn apart by explosions, killing 168. Office workers, passers-by, children in the building's daycare center. Horrified, a nation in grief turned to the authorities for answers. Now, 20 years after that tragic day, we all know the story the public was told.
We will find the people who did this.
And
when we do, justice will be swift, certain, and severe.
Except for
John Doe number 2.
John Doe number 2.
John Doe number 2.
The majority of people still believe that Timothy McVeigh was a right-wing extremist who bombed the Oklahoma City building with a Ryder truck because he was upset with the government. People close to the event told a very different story.
A local congressman believes that convicted bomber Timothy McVeigh and his accused co-conspirator Terry Nichols are not the only ones involved.
The Oklahoma State Representative Charles Key produced a videotape featuring witnesses who claim to have seen Timothy McVeigh with another man the morning of the bombing.
He was wearing a ball cap. Timothy McVeigh had his on backwards, which is just like this. It was on his head. The other gentleman had his on like this.
We know there were 24 people that were interviewed by the FBI that said they saw Mr. McVeigh on April 19th with someone else, and they had no reason to make it up. They didn't have a dog in that fight. They didn't have any reason to make something up. They told the agents exactly what they saw, and the agents wrote it down. If only one person had seen it, or 2 or 3, but 24 people say, yes, I saw him with somebody else. That's pretty powerful.
As Coulson points out, in the immediate wake of the bombing, the largest manhunt in the history of the Bureau was launched to find the 2 men who were reported as having rented and driven the Ryder truck to its destination. John Doe number 1 was soon identified as McVeigh, but John Doe number 2, his accomplice, remained at large.
Who is John Doe number 2, and where is he? Employees at the truck rental business in Kansas also helped with a sketch of a man who they say was with McVeigh, a square-jawed suspect with a tattoo on his left arm. Authorities made a second, then a third sketch of John Doe 2 with a ball cap based on a description from an Oklahoma City man who says he gave McVeigh and John Doe 2 directions to Northwest 5th and Harvey, the Murrah building, 30 minutes before the bombing. So he pulls up and, gets out of the truck?
No, he pulls up and I go up to the truck. I went to see what he needed. He said he was kind of lost a little bit. He said he was looking for 5th and Harvey, was the words he gave me. He did not distinct a building, the Murrah building or nothing like that. He just asked me where a direction of 5th and Harvey was. I kind of tried to explain it to him verbally, and he could seem a little confused by the way I was explaining it to him. So at that time, he got out of the truck, and I kind of walked him about 3 or 4 feet from where we were standing and pointed it out to him, the direction where it was.
The first man is of medium build with a light brown crew cut, and he is right-handed.
McVeigh is identified as the mystery man John Doe 1 and arrested.
The second man is also medium build. He's further described as 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with brown hair and a tattoo visible on his left arm.
What happens next is a conspiracist's dream.
John Doe number 2 remains at large. He should be considered armed and extremely dangerous.
But 2 months later, the FBI calls off the search. The official line is,
never existed. In McVeigh's unprecedented 3.5-week trial, the prosecution didn't show the CCTV footage of him and John Doe number 2 parking the Ryder truck. Didn't explain why 24 separate witnesses mass hallucinated the existence of John Doe number 2. Didn't explain why the government was testing truck bombs and the Army was storing Ryder trucks at Camp Gruber right before the bombing. And didn't talk to the FBI informants who blew the whistle on the plot. But they did collaborate with the CIA, and they did convict McVeigh as the lone wolf bomber and Terry Nichols as his bomb-constructing accomplice.
You proposed a law for the Knesset to pass against Arabs that's really astonishingly identical to the Nuremberg laws of the Nazis under Adolf Hitler.
Mr. Wallace, one of the problems of Jews is that they wouldn't know a Jewish concept if they tripped over one. I merely quoted from the Talmud. Most Jews think that Judaism is Thomas Jefferson. It's not.
Now I'm sad and lonely since I put down the Jews. Well,